meeting that was scheduled a while ago to really start getting us ready for all of the things we need to do about this time of year, from budget to Doug's goals and objectives for the next year. But also we got this thing called COVID going on here that's impacting everything we do. So we've got a fairly aggressive agenda today. I'm hoping that we can learn from these, because there's a lot of meaty information here, both on finances, kind of where our priorities should be on the business plan. And then I know that a number of you wanted to kind of get an update of where we are on fare enforcement changes. And so we got some good information on that. And so I'm hoping that when we're done with this, we again, as we're going on, we can have a dialogue about these issues. And if we're some issues we need to make sure are in our work plan and priorities for next year, we do that. I think staff has identified a number of issues that we need to pay attention to. And I'm looking forward to two days discussion, and I want to thank the staff for getting all of this stuff out to us ahead of time, because I spent some time with it last night and do have a few questions. So I'm thinking that the board will probably have those. So Doug, good work. I think it's a busy day, and hopefully we can breeze right through this and not take more time than we need. But I don't want to crimp on the time either. So Doug, to you.
Okay, thank you, Bruce, and to all the board members. I do want to double down on thanking everybody. For everybody, this is the third time, not only in the month, this is the third time in the week. And for a few people like Director Simmons, we're up to about 5 times here in the month. So we've clearly used up our credit, and we hope we'll free you up shortly at about 12:30 today. So we do have a robust agenda here today covering several topics. It's really put into a couple categories. The first one that we're going to cover off, you can see the flow of the agenda. I've asked Dee to give us an update on not only how we doing. We're still early in the year. We don't even have the first quarter behind us. What does the current year look like as we think about next year's budget and our business plan? But also I've asked her to take a bit of, I'll call, assumptions in its purest sense, A plus B equals C, and look at the multi-year projection. And you can see some significant drop-offs here in year 3 for the agency revenue-wise. Please do not take that as there's lots of levers that we have at our disposal, but that's its purest form to help in the understanding of the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead. I wanted to put that first solely as we go back to just over a week ago. We reviewed last week's business plan update on how we did last year in the business plan. So this is really setting the stage for the business plan discussion today, but I think we really need to have a better understanding of the levers on the finance side that go with some of the assumptions and the opportunities and challenges that faces us in the year and years ahead. So that's really the first 2 parts. Then we'll take a break, and after that we've got a couple other parts that I had committed to the board I would do last just around pre-COVID time, was right now about fare enforcement. So Bernie's going to walk us through a scan of fare enforcement and hopefully have a healthy and robust conversation amongst the board members today on a free fare system. So what's going on out there? And then finally, the other item is round fares, is how is code enforcement doing? We set this up with Low Income Fare through John Gardner's great work and the whole team's work a few years ago now. How is this actually shaping up? So between the two, you can see the fare piece is the second part of the agenda. So we've got lots to go on. So maybe I'll just turn it right over to Dee right now to move on to the finance piece first. Dee, over to you.
Okay, Dee, I'm passing you the presenter.
Uh-oh.
If you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. So staff's worked very hard to put this presentation together, and we've worked on it right up until late last night. So the first area we're going into is payroll taxes. We're currently down about 4% compared to the budget. That means our first 2 months of our fiscal year 21 budget, we are down 4% and 10% compared to prior year. On passenger revenue, we're down approximately 34% compared to budget and 62% compared to prior year. And that's $11.6 million, 62%. It's unknown whether it will be something that we can recapture. We'll see. Federal formula funding, TriMet will not be penalized due to ridership reductions or increased operating costs in fiscal year 22 and 23 because the formulas are based on prior year numbers, fiscal year 2019, 2020, or 2021, whichever is higher. Now, this is the money we get from the federal government every year. It's about $63 million, and it's calculated based on ridership and numerous other factors that are provided by the NTP, and it's 2 years behind in terms of we used 2 years ago data in order to calculate current year. But they have assured us that we're not going to be penalized due to the drops based on the pandemic. And for calculation purposes, future year growth is forecasted to be flat in fiscal year 2022, but growing 2% or 1.3 million every year thereafter. We wanted to talk a little bit about the two specific types of funding, the CARES Act funding. As you may recall, we received just under 185 million. We have been pulling this down primarily using our preventive maintenance expenditures so that we could get all the money in-house and use it to fill the gaps for fiscal year 21, and potentially some of it is being pushed into 22. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But 1.9 million is earmarked for the City of Portland streetcar. They've been given the rules of the game regarding how they can apply for and receive this funding based on CARES expenditures. STIF funding, it's based on, currently we're considering using it for service preservation. Over 60 million was received but not yet spent. 25.5 million is expected to be received in fiscal year 21. And 32.8 is dedicated to capital projects, and use of 60 million already includes the use of 60 million already received, meaning that we have money in the pipeline, we have money that is dedicated to projects that can't be changed to something else, and just to reinforce, it could be eligible to maintain service. We're still waiting to hear 100% on that. As for service, in the forecast, what we've done is we've taken 43% of total service reductions have been added back. We've factored that in. The 43%, the total service that was reduced, that was 18.3%, included bus, max, and West. The amount that was restored was just bus, and that equals 43% of the total. West service has remained unchanged, still operating at a 34% cut. The lift service was not reduced per se, but since it's a demand service, it has adjusted itself. Current fiscal year is operated at 62% below the previous year. Ridership there's a gradual trend upward. As you can see, we had the big drop in April. We're starting to move back up. We are currently in about the 40 to 42% area over this last week. Operating expenses were down approximately 21% compared to budget. This is good. And 10% compared to the prior year. Service reductions, hiring freeze, fuel costs are contributing to the 7.8 million in savings so far. And that's the 7.8 million in the roughly 10% based on prior year right here. Okay, so let's get into some of the modeling assumptions on which the numbers you will see in a minute are based. Ridership is anticipated to slowly return until reaching pre-COVID levels by the end of 2024. All financial modeling anticipates that fare increases will resume with a fare increase of 10 cents starting in fiscal year 2022 and every other year thereafter. And as for service, the model includes DTP service starting in fiscal year 2023, that's Division Transit, and Red Line starting in fiscal year 2024. And this, of course, is dependent upon us actually receiving the almost 100 million from the federal government. Stiff service, service preservation or expansion, all other service levels remain constant. No additional external funding is expected. Debt ceiling remaining at 7.5%. Months of operating reserves remain at 2.25 months. M&S, materials and supplies, held constant with 2021 levels, no automatic annual increase. General fund capital investments at 18.5 million in fiscal year 2022 and 10 million annually thereafter. Personnel services are maintained at fiscal year 2021 levels in fiscal year 22, increasing every year thereafter. We have built-in continued pension contributions of 5.5 million for the management plan and 25 million for the union plan. So here is the bottom line. Shortfalls are projected. We were able to push fund balance forward to balance fiscal year 2022, given all the constraints that I just described. This is a base case. There is no allowance for continuing expense or one-time only budget increases every year, so no more Bud 5s for the foreseeable future, or automatic service increases for capacity and reliability. Obviously, additional revenues or expense reductions are needed past fiscal year 22. But as Doug had mentioned early on in this presentation, we have many levers at our disposal to adjust as we approach the shortfalls. And there may also be some additional federal money coming forward, which is not included in the plan. But fiscal year 23 is going to be the significant drop off at 96 million, 32.5 for 24, 3 million in 25 and 1.5 in 26. So unless something changes pretty dramatically, we won't be in a positive spend until 2027. Of course, we'll balance this budget. There's no question that fiscal year 2023 will be balanced. We wouldn't put forward a budget that wasn't balanced, but it does mean that some significant changes will have to occur in the way we do business in order to make that happen. So given that, I'm open for questions.
Dee, I may just get you to ask also to comment on the use of the STIF funds. Typically, it was intended through the HP 17 for expansion and selector programs. Maybe if you can just comment to some of the conversations we've been having around it as it relates to this.
Certainly. We have a few assumptions that we have built in here. Right now, I believe that the actual utilization of STIF funds to continue service or to maintain operations is still in flux. Bernie, I'm going to turn to you now to tell us what the status of that is.
So ODOT has indicated to us, so just a little bit of background. STIF funds, the House Bill 2017 legislation, was very clear in trying to provide that STIF funds could only be used for additions to the system. So the intent there was to prevent local governments and other entities from backing out their contribution to the transit system and replacing it with STIF funds. The legislature wanted it to be additive, not just a maintenance of effort. And so there's language in the legislation that essentially says that you can't use STIF funds to replace local funds that have been withdrawn. In this case, ODOT has indicated that we have some flexibility that we can use STIF funds to maintain existing services if the loss of revenue is due to COVID and the economic downturn. So they've expressed the willingness to have us use the funds more flexibly. That won't last forever. At some point, they're going to go back to the original rule and say, no, this has to be additive of local funds.
So have they made the determination that we can actually use this money like that, or do we have to jump through a few more hoops to do it?
You know, they haven't written a specific rule around this yet, so we're kind of feeling our way through it. But they've indicated that they're going to be flexible in giving us the opportunity to define the funds, in this case, for a capital program, and then use those, transfer those funds or reallocate those funds within the plan period to preservation of service if needed. Part of the difficulty that we have with the STIF program, given the changing dynamics here, is that you submit your STIF plan for a 2-year period and there's no opportunity to amend that during the year. So you kind of have to create a plan that has built-in flexibility, and then work with ODOT over the course of the 2-year period to find out how you can use that.
Okay, so that's one of the levers that we can use, we will be able to use most likely in order to balance the budget. Doug, was there anything else you wanted to discuss regarding STIF funding?
No, I think that captures it, but it does get to, if you start to look at, you know, through next fiscal year, if we really manage things frugally, which we always try and do, and be careful not to add too many desirous programs on, which take consulting money or whatever other things, we've really got to manage the organization fiscally tight. But then if you look at $100 million, $96 million, let's call it 100 for this conversation, then you know, you're looking at $20-30 million generally in range for us for the STIF part. That's a bit of a wag on my end, I fully admit it, but it's a significant help to us in this $100 million in 2023. So it's material.
I see Director Simmons has her hand up.
Dee, help us to understand, you said in 23, there would be some levers that would have to be exercised in order for a balanced budget. Can you give us some examples of what some of those levers might be?
Of course. So we've got the obvious one, which is service cuts. We also have layoffs, we have furloughs, we have also possibly temporarily pulling back on our contributions to the liability, the pension fund liability accounts. We have obviously continued belt tightening internally and cutting back on expenses to some degree.
So it would be very painful.
Very painful.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ozzy, I think you had your hand up next. Ozzy, are you there? Oh, there he is. Oh.
Sorry, I must have muted myself. I understand that the STIF funds are a potential lever, and it's not entirely clear what pulling that lever means right now. But at this time, is there any thoughts on when or what conditions would prompt us to start pulling that lever? And do you have any speculation on what it would look like, and as far as what role the board would have in helping address whether that those funds get reallocated? Do we know anything about the potential for this process or what the process would look like?
Well, what we have is the first thing we would do is obviously work with Doug to determine whether or not this was a lever that we intended to use first. It most likely would be, because what this means is that the planned use of the funds, of the STIF funds, will be deferred until the economy returns and it gets better and we get more funding. We would propose that. It's really an operational decision. So the general manager would be the one that would be the person who would say, okay, we're going to pull this lever. And then it would be folded into the budget process for fiscal year 23. It would come to the board as part of the budget. So I don't think it's a decision for the board unless it's a decision whether to approve the budget or not. But Doug, Bernie, feel free to weigh in.
Well, I just note that there's one other or two other steps in the process, for using STIF funds to maintain current services. The first step is that there's a STIF advisory committee that's meeting now, and they are responsible for approving the initial STIF funding proposal. We've gone to that committee and suggested to them a framework that allows flexibility for the use of the STIF funds to maintain existing services. They haven't yet approved that, but assuming they do, that would then come to the TriMet board, and ultimately that would go to the Oregon Transportation Commission for final approval. Once that's approved, then it's within the purview of either Doug as the general manager or Doug and the board to make adjustments within the parameters of that plan.
Thank you, Bernie. I have a follow-up on that, and this is about just procedure again. Doug, this one's for you. Where is the consideration going to reside for what potential STIF-related projects get delayed? Is that going to be at the STIF committee? Is that happening within ops? Will there be opportunities to at least review criteria as a board of how that decision will be taking place?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, Ozzy. It'll probably be a combination of all of those things. So there will be some criteria established, like service, making sure, like when we jumped into the COVID, let's go back 6 months ago, we established some COVID around how we protect key areas of our routes in the decision making. So I think we issued a document on that for now that was COVID time, so we didn't have a lot of time. We had to really move fast, but to protect areas of inequity, for example, was one of the variables, and that would continue to be one of the variables as well. So there will be some absolute ops decisions, internal ops decisions around structure and spare ratio on buses. How tight do we run the rubber band, so to speak? How fast or slow do we delay electrification out? For example, at Division Transit, Bernie and I were talking about this yesterday, is as Division Transit comes online, and once the line it opens, there's a bunch of reallocated existing bus hours. Do we have to, because of our financial circumstance, have to phase that in as opposed to just turn the dial on and do it all at once? So there'll be a whole lot of those criteria, many of those topics, in addition to the internal ones, as I call squeeze the orange internally. I do come back to at the COVID, and I still say it's relevant today. There were 4 key principles I laid out at the time when COVID hit, knowing that COVID was a virus, but there's an economic comet tail that comes with it, and here we are. One of them was safety. We will not compromise safety. And I think we've all seen and loved where people play to the edge on safety. I've seen examples in my prior life and mentors before me where they've had to shut down whole rail lines because they couldn't find the money to run it safely. And so WMATA is an example where they ran it and they had money, but they didn't do it safely. So safety for me is a foundational one for this agency. A second one was preservation of service to the degree we financially can afford, which gets into some of the conversation around services and routes. So yes, there'd be some criteria to that. The third one would be around preservation of jobs, knowing how hard I believe it's going to be for people who are impacted internally in TriMet to find other alternative employment. So that's one of the principles I laid out at the front end. So I want to minimize any impacts to our employees, knowing that we're going to be growing again at some point. And it takes a while to educate and train people on the complexity of our business. And the fourth one, which here we are talking about today, is financial resiliency and financial flexibility. So things like paratransit, which is an on-demand service, things like Ride Connection, things like WES. There are a list of these other priorities. So we will look at it on all of those contexts and develop some parameters that we will be reviewing with you. We have an immense amount of work to do, and there's a lot of moving variables. This is just A plus B equals, here's a photograph of the moment work. So but we wanted you to be aware of what our latest thinking is But as the revenue projections and injects change, including federally, a stroke like that, we could be back to CARES Act 2, and here we go again, right? So we have to be flexible in that resiliency of nimbleness, but be ready in case the hard times come. So that's part of this shaping amoeba of our financial model and the related service and parameters that will have to come with that. So yes, that would be brought back to and through the board.
Thank you, Doug. I really appreciate you sharing some of the criteria that you're going to be incorporating into these decisions. And I understand the need for agility in all of this. I want to underscore the potential benefit as a board member to being able to have some visibility as you're adjusting to these things and applying this criteria. I think it provides a major learning opportunity, and it enables us to better prepare ourselves to answer questions or to have a deeper understanding of why these hard decisions need to be put into place. So yeah, that's I really appreciate that. I look forward to learning more about these difficult moments as the agency adjusts.
Yeah, these are these are not easy things. Before my life in this industry, I used to work in the oil industry. We used to our price of oil would change literally every day, and so there's a nimbleness that is in the culture. We've been more historically of a semi-utility kind of. We see that in our pricing. We haven't changed prices in an awfully long time. So as a government agency, we have other responsibilities far beyond the private sector that we have to factor in. So the decision making on things like this is more complex, and we need to make sure we listen accordingly and understand the impacts, because there are impacts, right? So it's always easy to put more water in and all boats rise when you put more water into the pond, but sometimes you have to attack and take it out. So we will have some time on this one. This is the 2023. But although D showed, as you can see on 22, it shows 0. This work started back in March. We just don't run ahead and run our business accordingly and go, gee, what happened? We've already started those decisions driven by COVID, as you saw, like $20 million in savings. So, cutting back, freezing salaries, freezing hiring to the degree possible. It can go down a long list. Now, the other part we haven't talked about is also capital. We've talked about the operating budget, but there's also the capital piece, which is all part of, some of it's federally related. And as that funding continues, and the degree it does, that may help protect us on some projects. But there's a lot of operating capital as well, and those levers are in play also.
Good.
That's right. That's why you saw that we still are anticipating 18 million going into the capital program, and then 10 million every year thereafter. So it's we do realize that there are certain things we have to continue in the capital side, and we can't defund. We can't operate if we do. But other programs that are funded by STIF will continue. Obviously, the low-income fare program, that's going to continue. There's no question about that. But the amount of money that we'll be putting into the capital program from the general fund is just going to be extremely limited compared to what our expectations were in the past.
Good discussion. Ozzy, were you done? Get your questions answered there? Okay, good. Laura, you took your hand down. Is that correct?
Well, I'll just go ahead and ask my question real quick. Thank you. And I may have missed this, but to what extent do you have assumptions around whether the transportation measure is going to pass in November? Does that play into these projections?
No, it does not, because the funding for that program is primarily external. We do have, if you recall, when we set up the budget for fiscal year 21, we anticipated a bond issue of 200 million. We intend to only bring approximately 120 million of that in-house if we get the funding for the Red Line project. The difference between that and the 200 million is dependent upon the ballot measure. We would still have the room to include TriMet's 75 million contribution if that's where we decided to go. So it's debt service or bonds or GARBIes against the federal money. if it passes.
Great, thank you.
I see Travis and Keith have their hands up. I'll start with Travis.
So we talked about the potential for the expense reductions and pulling back potentially on some of the capital expenditures depending on resources. What about, you mentioned it, Dee, and I know this is to be pure speculation, but ultimately what we're seeing for 2023 and the significant decrease in the funding of close to $100 million, that's going to be related to the COVID situation, the lingering impact of that. Are we hearing any possibilities of, I shouldn't say are we hearing any possibilities because it sounds like we already are, but what would be the estimation of a probability of additional federal funds to help us close that gap? I mean, that's a significant gap. And the challenge that I see is that if we're doing all we can today to curb the potential job loss because of COVID, this is an extension of that. And we could have that proverbial second shoe drop because of what's going on now, and the COVID situation is going to cause potential unemployment in the year 2023. So, I know it's like I said, I know it's speculation and conjecture, but are we hearing any potential probabilities of an additional round of stimulus that could go out to 2023 and maybe even 2024?
Well, we are hearing that, and I'll turn it over to Bernie in just a minute, but I did want to let you know that there are a few indications that the economy is going to be returning faster than we thought. The state has revised their economic projections, and they brought in their recovery level 1 year, meaning that they expect the recovery to be 1 year sooner than it had originally been, which I thought it was out to 24. Now it's back to 23. And so there is that. But we do have the HEROES Act that is moving its way through Congress. And at this point, I have figured out that, with Bernie's help, we figured out that what it says is that the amount of money that we got from the CARES Act 1 and plus the CARES Act 2 can't be more than our entire operating budget in 2018. And since there's no chance that that's going to happen, I think that whatever money comes through to TriMet of the $32 billion that's in that particular act, we'll be able to draw down 100% of it. So as far as the crystal ball, now I'm going to turn it over to Bernie.
Yeah, well, crystal ball is cloudy, but the House has introduced a supplemental appropriations bill, which is, sort of CARES Act 2. It's got $13.5 billion in it in the 5307 formula program, which is the main program that we receive operating funds through. And as Dee mentioned, the way that would work if it passes is that we would get our normal formula allocation, and the amount that we received from the combined first and second CARES Act couldn't exceed our operating losses or our total operating local operating resource from 2018. And that's we're not likely to hit that target. It's all upside for us. The question is really whether the Senate will take up and agree with the House proposal. The Senate has put forward a number of drafts for a COVID-2 response. None of them have included a transit component. So if the Senate does agree with a financial package, a second CARES Act, it's likely that, just rule of thumb, if you have a program in one body and not in the other, you have to conference that, and it will be less in all likelihood than what the House has proposed. How much less? I don't know. So you've got kind of a compounding projection. Will the Senate take it up? And then what happens in the conference? My guess is that there will be something either in a lame duck session or next Congress. and that it'll include a transit package. In, you know, how much, that's a tougher equation to figure out.
But I might just add to this. There's, as you can tell, there's several dynamics, a lot of gates we have to go through. I think what I can confirm is the model of the assumptions you have with the numbers in front of you is going to be wrong, because there's going to be so many variables that are going to change as more time goes on and we understand more, whether it be the T2020 discussion, whether it be who's the fundamental president of the United States coming up, and the philosophy of how transit fits into the use as a country. The federal reappropriation, I think, is up next year, Bernie, in terms of the overall funding between Congress, the Senate, the Congress, and the president. So that impacts the capital funding, of which how things get allocated to what we consider our normal course, semi-normal course of business. How much capital is actually going to be in that at a time of very large U.S. federal deficits going on. So let alone a CARES Act 2, a HEROES Act, whatever else will be. Part of our strategy here is where we started to manage our expenses right immediately at the start of COVID and the economic impacts that come with this, is knowing to stretch this out as much as possible early on to save those dollars for the back end, to minimize, instead of this being 96, the last version we had yesterday morning was around $127 million. So it's moving as we literally speak, based on assumptions that are continuously moving. So I think Bernie's right. There is going to have to be some semblance of a rescue package. We're trying to come in after some of the other federal large transit agencies who are in far more desperate state than we are. They may be tied to sales tax, and their sales tax has plummeted now. And so they're probably going to hit a severe wall far sooner than we would, as you can see by these numbers. Some of them are hitting it right now this fiscal year, let alone fiscal 22, let alone fiscal 23. So we're trying to, as a strategy, draft behind them to minimize our impact, to hopefully we can grab the economy on a bit of more of an upward trend sooner, to minimize the net impact of this agency. So that's a bit of the strategy in the back room.
Travis, did that answer your question? And do you have anything else?
Well, yeah, no, it does answer my question, but I've just got a quick follow-up. So, when I'm doing financial projections, the question, I'm always kind of giving just an overview of what my perception is of the projection that I just delivered. So if we were to do that here, if you're comfortable, would this be kind of the, and as Doug just referenced, it's dynamic, it's moving almost daily based on all the new information that's coming and flowing. But if we were looking at this kind of as a worst case, kind of average or best case scenario, what category would we generally throw this into?
Well, this is our base case. This is our most, frankly, very stringent projection. It does include growth, as we mentioned, and it does include some expectations of return of fare revenue. If that doesn't come to pass, these numbers get worse.
Yeah.
And so we're monitoring this, as Doug mentioned, daily. And so as conditions change, I think Michael has run about 30 different scenarios so far. So we're continuing to monitor and consider every aspect of this.
Excellent. Thank you.
I think what's fair to add on to what Dee said is, we think this is probably the conservative case for us. We know we will balance to zero. The only question is, what choices do we have to make to get to zero? And that's when we overlay all the elements and I call the levers at our disposal to get there. And that's where I overlay the principles we talked about. One change in injection from the federal government could change all this in just a heartbeat. I think it will have a high probability of some semblance coming to help us, but we can't plan that's going to arrive. We have to do the work as though it's not. If it comes, that'd be even better. But I think this is probably a conservative overlay. Dee, is that fair?
Exactly. And so if you may recall, we're not projecting that ridership is going to return to pre-pandemic levels until 2024. So right at the end of 2024, as you can see from even these numbers show you that there will be a drop off in the shortfall based on what we know today. But Doug's right, we won't present an unbalanced budget to you. So we will make some changes and we'll keep you apprised. We will be taking reports on, I believe, Doug, you said you wanted these quarterly to the F&A committee so that everybody understands how conditions are changing. And if anything dramatic happens, we'll certainly advise you sooner.
Okay. Travis, anything else?
Not for me.
All right. Keith, I see your hand's been up for a while.
Yes. I think there's a third leg to this stool, and that's ATU. And I just was wondering if has there been any preliminary conversations, or are there plans to have conversations with them so that they're an ally and not a hindrance to making this happen, in case, when we come up against it?
Maybe I can comment to that one. So without getting into the details of bargaining, some of this information of the backdrop has been shared at a high level. This is still unfolding, and the answer is absolutely. It's a critical partner to the viability of everybody. So for me, it's a must, Keith. That has to happen and continue to happen. I'm looking past the current bargaining photograph, but yes, those dynamics have been shared, and not to be dramatic about it, but it's just this is bigger than all of us. But we need to be open and sharing the challenges that come with this, and including the principles I shared around preservation of jobs. That's been on all my town halls. I do in fact, I think I did one yesterday. So it comes up again, these 4 principles of safety, preservation of jobs, preservation of service, and financial resiliency. So they are well steeped in that. And the decisions to go against that, even the unpopularity of things like hazard pay. Well, I'd rather preserve jobs than pay hazard pay, so to speak, those trade-offs, right? So, or the overtime conversations that always have different philosophies of what it should be. So it shows up almost every question every time I have a town hall. So I'd say, yes, they're well aware and must continue to be a partner and well aware of this going forward. So great comment.
Great. Thank you very much.
Kathy, maybe pick your hand down.
I did, but actually I'll ask. I don't know if this is covered, but I'm just curious as to if we are also trying to explore, you mentioned furloughs, unfortunately some layoffs, but are salary freezes also going to be taken into consideration? And I'm thinking, especially for folks who are on the executive, at the executive or director level.
As a matter of fact, that was put into play early last year. As soon as the pandemic hit, certain things happened right away. We froze hiring, we froze salaries. There's no wage increase current year for management employees. That may continue. So yes, we are definitely using that already.
I guess a follow-up to that is, and I hope we're doing this maybe annually, is also surveying our employees. I could just assume that with COVID and now with a lot of just the uncertainty in our financial outlook for the next couple of years, that people might be worried, stressed, anxious, maybe about their position. So I'm just wondering, I guess this is more also like an employee wellness question. So I'm not sure if there might be others in addition to Dee who can answer just how are we assessing how our folks are doing, particularly in this time, and as we again, head into 2023, will there be, continued assessment and programs to, again, help our employees?
That would be a question that I'll turn over to Kim, Sewell, and Doug, but we are working on it. Just my own observation is that we are definitely taking steps, increasing town halls, working on people's needs and so on. So Doug, Kim, do you have any?
I can share that we've had many attempts at engagement with our employees and communications to remind them of the services they have, of the EAP that they have. We've changed a lot of our leave policies to help them deal with the COVID and the wildfires. We actually just met with, I just met with my group about doing another survey for employees to kind of reach out to them, see how they're doing. We're regularly having folks have remote meetings where they engage with their employees, check in, have kind of a wellness check with them. So we are well aware that on top of the economic issues, there's all sorts of issues related to the remote world, and very much focused on making sure our employees do feel supported and do feel engaged.
Kathy, I maybe just to add to the first part of your point and question you raised was, are people feeling anxious, concerned for jobs? The answer is yes. You couldn't help but not. That starts with the executive team all the way through. These are forgetting COVID, protests, riots, economy, all these things, fires. Cumulatively, it's taken a significant toll, not only inside TriMet, but I suspect all people, no matter where you work or how you live. So the answer is yes, it is. We are doing town halls that I personally host every 2 weeks. I write out twice a week to all employees with best efforts. All of our leaders at the executive level down are having their own staff meetings on a regular basis. So we've had to accelerate communication up to the degree possible. But we know, in fact, I just did a town hall yesterday with our team, and it was about mental wellness and the spiritual health of yourself, not really in a religious sense, but how do you cope? How do you manage? So we had people from the Cascade Center in to help us, and they walked through people of tools and tips and techniques that people can use personally. And the feedback we get is actually very well attended and very appreciated. And it's all across whether you're a cleaner, you're a bus operator, mechanic, transit planner, engineer, executive members, we're all in this together. And so I think the answer is yes. It's forefront for everybody is their own stability for themselves and their families. So yeah, we're very aware of this.
Thank you.
Good. Travis, did you raise your hand again?
Oh, I did not. I need to put it down.
Okay. Well, I have a couple real quick questions because I think we're running out of time on this agenda item, but good information, staff, and everybody putting this together, and good questions. Dee, the question I had is you in the airline industry are looking at 2024 as being when things get back to normal or we get back to pre-COVID levels. Is that based on something from like our national like APTA giving us some ideas of what's going on, or is that just your best guess?
That is our best guess. We've been looking at it, and also the state's return, the economic return. We're running these numbers at approximately not 100% return, but eventually to in the high 90% return to pre-pandemic levels. Working with the service folks in Bernie's group, that's generally the estimate.
Okay, good.
Bruce, just to that one, I might just add on. I won't say the name of the multinational corporations, but I did some checking myself with folks I used to know in past life, and their economists are projecting something similar.
Okay, good, thank you. And then the other one I just wanted to note of is make sure everybody picked up on the one assumption you've got there is the 10-cent increase in fares beginning, I think it was 2023, and then every other year after that, or maybe it was 2022 if you were doing, but obviously that would be very contentious. And again, so just reminding everybody, we look at these numbers, that those numbers do have those in there, right, Dee?
Correct. We anticipate that the fare increases will begin again and continue.
Yeah. So again, another big policy issue for the board to talk about, and has big swings on this budget. I'm just pointing it out. So Doug, unless you have something else, I don't see anybody else's hands raised right at the moment. I think we ought to declare victory on this agenda item. And I do want to thank everybody because I think it's a great piece of work. And obviously we're going to be talking about this a lot in the next few months.
Yeah, no question. I think just for clarity, we have in our budget is fiscal 22, a fare increase, if my recollection was, and I was going to talk about this in the November strategy session, but since you've raised it, this would be, we would kick off probably December or January. The intention would be a very extensive public outreach on any fare increase. I think we've all been around long enough. There's no fare increases ever welcomed by anybody in any part of life. So that would include a very extensive early next calendar year rollout and consultation process, and that would be brought back to the board as part of the budget process for fiscal 22.
All right. Thank you, Doug.
Okay. And we're ready to move on.
All right, good. So I'll turn it back to you then, Doug, and Alan.
Okay, Alan, I think the stage is set with the backdrop of the financial piece, at least a photograph of the moment. That photograph will change. And I can just remind the board of just last week when Alan did a quick update on how the agency was doing in the rearview mirror from last year, where we exceeded, where we met, and where we did not exceed for a variety of reasons. So, Alan, I'm just going to turn over to you to set the stage. Now that we're starting to, at the early stage, build this next fiscal year rolling 5-year plan, but it fits into next fiscal year budget process, but it's a 5-year rolling plan. So Ellen, I'm just turning over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And that's exactly it. We're just a quarter into the fiscal year, but it's time really to start thinking seriously about the next fiscal year and the business plan, which is, covers 5 years, but we're updating it every year to make sure that we're adjusting. And it seems like every year something big comes up as we go along, and 2020 is an exception in the size of the something big coming along, but it's right in keeping with all of that. So I don't have a presentation. We did send some materials ahead in your packet, so I will be referring to those. My hope is you all have had a great series of questions and some conversation already around the financials. And frankly, though, the questions that came up at last week's meeting were around COVID. When we really look at it, more of the impacts come from the economic reverberations of that than COVID itself. And so I think that just flows right into this conversation. So what I'll do is point you to, and very briefly, hopefully, summarize the materials that we sent ahead. And then I'm going to kind of point us back towards the points of emphasis, which is the one-page list that we had in there. That, again, remember, in the business plan, we've got a few things that help set the stage of our direction for the business plan. There are premises, or they could also be assumptions. There are strategic priorities that are multi-year priorities. And to the extent those come up, it would be great to hear comments on those. But it really felt like, those are multi-year strategies, even though a lot has changed at the more detail level. The overall strategies haven't changed as much. And so the idea is to really focus in on the points of emphasis. But before I turn to those, at last week's meeting, I think it was Board Member Gonzalez had a question about sort of how our business plan had been impacted by COVID and by the economic impacts. And we promised we would get a document out, and we put together something pretty quickly, and I reviewed it with a number of the executive team, not the entire team of people who are working on key strategic actions at the agency, because that's 50 plus people, but a number. And then that is included in your document, in your packet. And I just want to point to a few, or talk through a few highlights there. And I invite comments or questions at any point, but I didn't think it made sense for us to dive into too much detail unless you specifically want to take us there. So feel free to do that, but I won't dive into too much detail. For all of you, this material that I'll be talking about starts on electronic page 17 of the document, so the 17th page in, with the 2 pages that show the colorful goals and objectives from the business plan. Those have not changed. We generally believe those are high enough level that they don't need to change each year, and did not see anything that specifically needed to change for in response to the challenges that we're facing. Following that is a number of pages that takes the COVID-19 addendum contents, which was the key strategic actions, which of the 5 years those actions were happening in, and then additional notes, and anything that was a significant change from the business plan that we published in March of 2020 was highlighted in yellow. When we went back to look at all of these, then it seemed like it made sense to flag the ones that really have significant COVID-19 ongoing impacts, flag the ones that we expect to have significant economic volatility, financial capability impacts, and then there's a third new column of impacts noted there. And I just want to hit a few highlights, not so much on the individual key strategic actions, but the kind of effects that we see. As you would absolutely expect, I think ridership and the employment and payroll tax inputs have a lot to do with it. And when I took a step back and looked at all of these, here's kind of the big picture. So there are just over 130 key strategic actions split into the different objectives and assigned to more than 50 different people across the agency as leads. Of those, about 2/3 have some kind of pretty clear and direct impact from either COVID-19 and or from our anticipated economic impacts. Basically, the ones that didn't are generally the ones that are things that we can do with current staff or are far enough underway that we don't think it's going to have a huge impact. Such as, for example, Division Transit Project. Of the ones that are impacted, close to 2/3 are impacted by some kind of economic picture, and a little bit under 1/3 are directly impacted by COVID. So let me just step through, if you're in the packet, starting on that very first page, which I think on the document itself is labeled as page 3, but in the electronic packet would be the 19th page. And that's with the satisfied riders goal 1. And you can see there's a mix of impacts from COVID-19 and impacts from economic. Any box that's filled in with color means that has a significant impact. There's no meaning to the one that's filled in red. That's just a typo. And then the kinds of impacts we see are obviously ridership impacts. COVID-19 has impacts not only on our operations, but also in our outreach. There are a number of engagement strategies that we're using. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't have the packet.
Oh, okay. I can share my screen.
Yeah,
I
looked at the information that was sent out in the share thing, but I didn't actually make a copy of it.
Gotcha. Okay. So that's what I'm speaking to. I don't think it's that critical, but I'll go ahead and share it on my screen here so I can just point to things, if that helps. Thanks for stopping me and letting me know. So the items here that are impacted by COVID, the items that are impacted by economic effects, not everything is impacted, but a number are. And there are, as I think I was saying, there are a number that have impacts from our ability to do, oops, sorry, what just happened? There we go. Our ability to do outreach with COVID is very much impacted. Face-to-face engagement is difficult or ill-advised under these conditions. And so that really puts emphasis on other techniques, lots of phone calls, some video, other ways of getting in touch with people. And so there are those kinds of impacts, and a number of our efforts include engagement with communities, with stakeholders, with various groups across the region, and therefore are impacted directly by COVID. It almost goes without saying maybe that there are a number of financial capability question marks with the economic volatility. You just saw that from Dee. A number of years where we have impacts from the slowly recovering economy, and those obviously put into question our ability to handle the needs of these key strategic actions. I guess I would say there aren't any that were so obviously impacted that we feel like we already have to take off the list. But already with the COVID-19 addendum, which we did in May of this year, we already knew we had to move a number of them. And that's why you see these that have changed, added years or shifted years with the notes. That really captures the majority of the impacts that we see between COVID-19 and the financial impacts. There are others that we're able to continue because, as I said, either we have the funding, for example, here on the one I'm pointing to, the low-income fare program, as Dee mentioned, that's continuing on schedule because although STIF funding will also be impacted like everything else, presumably, that is a portion of the STIF funding, and so we're able to continue going with that. And to the extent that ridership is diminished, the draw on the low-income fare funding is somewhat diminished as well, even though we obviously have a much higher percentage of essential workers and lower-income riders in this time. And then demand as well. Demand obviously has dropped down significantly. We're in the 40-something% ridership compared to where we used to be pre-COVID, and that impacts the demand, and which means that we adjust service to react. I don't think I need to go through any more of this. I guess I will just say that, keys like personal safety, some of the key items there, though we recognize there may be some impacts to individual actions that may need to have things extended, none of them are things that we would put off because they're related to safety, and the same with reliability. With that, I will stop sharing at least momentarily and see if there are any thoughts or questions related to that, and then I'll move on to the points of emphasis and just kind of hopefully use that to spur some conversation amongst all of you.
And Linda, I think if you go to the next cloud on the iPad, TriMet iPad, you should be able to get to the board shared documents and for this meeting. And I think that presentation he just went through is all there. If it isn't, I'd be surprised. Questions? Oh, I see a few hands up. So Keith, you want to start?
Yes, and I didn't see, and maybe it was there, I glanced over it, I was looking earlier. A diversity initiative is part of the business plan. Is there an area that's going to be addressed in regards to a diversity initiative within TriMet? And I think that certainly needs to be, part of a business plan because it impacts business in a huge way because of the well-being of and the environment and atmosphere of TriMet.
Yes, absolutely, and thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, there are several places that diversity show up in the business plan, and all of those, continue. Obviously, that's highly important. The timing of it is probably a little uncertain for some of them. For example, under Objective 29 related to our own internal staffing, we had that employment diversity report. We have the recommendations that came from that we continue to act on. They may need to be extended to the extent that we're not hiring. As you heard, there's a pretty severe constriction on hiring. That makes it a little bit harder to hire new diverse candidates unless something that's critical comes open. But we also have efforts going forward in, trying to make sure that our training and our kind of management culture, it extends and is fully inclusive to diversity within TriMet staff, as well as the external efforts around trying to ensure more diversity in contracting, like our success with the Division Transit Project.
Thank you, Alan. I would also suggest, though, that perhaps, another survey needs to be done with employees, given COVID, given George Floyd, all the things that have occurred recently, to ascertain whether there is an issue or concern about discrimination or disparate treatment in the workplace. And I think that's, to me, that just makes sense to do that, because I am aware of issues, but at the same time, I don't know whether those issues are run rampant or whether they're just isolated incidents.
Perhaps I can comment on this one. Thank you, Keith, for raising this. So you'll actually see, even in my last draft of my own general manager deliverables for next year, is suggesting exactly that. We actually do a cultural survey across the organization, because as we want to make sure we're understanding the pulse, if you will, of the vibrancy of the organization. And the other one that's also in not only my draft general manager goals with you all is that can be in here is also a review of our policies, but specifically from a community of color perspective. There are policies that we've maybe had unintentional bias in that we don't know. So that's one of the deliverables that I have put forward for you, just for the general manager, let alone the organization. And there are some other ones as well, Keith.
Great, thank you very much.
Okay.
I had a comment on that topic. May I jump in, President Warner?
You may.
Thank you. I want to echo the sentiments from Director Edwards about the importance of getting feedback so that we know how to improve. I just want to cite that from what I've seen in equity policies, we are regulated at the federal level from what we can translate into policies based on what knowledge we gain from these surveys. The city just concluded a disparity analysis, which looked specifically at contracting. The city can now use that analysis to create new policies around inclusion and equity in contracting. But they have to rely on that disparity study to really point out how the policies are going to address known disparities. And I'm afraid that Director Edwards, a series of surveys will give us meaningful information, but may not be useful for us to do any sort of policy making around it, unless we are looking at a study that can essentially hold water with that federal standard. So I just say that because I want us to be getting feedback. I want us to go through the effort of having a touch point with staff. But I also want to acknowledge that if we want to look at where there might be a policy opportunity or some practice that is going to address disparity, a survey may not be the mechanism that allows us to do things in a policy kind of model. Now, I'm just talking about what I know about the contracting disparity policies, but I imagine some similar vein may be true with regards to human resources and anything we do with our goals for internal staffing.
Good comments. Does staff want to respond to all of that? I think it's just a great comment to think about as we move forward with this work next year, Doug.
Yeah, Oh, thank you. Got it.
Okay. Director Way? And Kathy's still muted.
Sorry. Just thinking about the wonderful speakers that we had last week as a board. And so, I think I also want to echo the equity piece in that it'd be great to look at different transit agencies and see how they're approaching the topic around employee. Again, I feel like for me, it's really about employee health and wellness, particularly as Director Edwards mentioned in a time where it could be so challenging to be, to be a person of color. But my question was for Alan around the sort of feedback loop with community involvement and engagement. And since this is a multi-year plan, obviously with COVID, things are going to have to be creative or different when we're trying to get some feedback for 2022. But can you tell us a little bit about how do you see the community engagement or the process looking like for next year? And then I guess my only comment around that is I think we're going to probably expect sort of this digital, remote learning style to continue. So what do we have in place where, potentially TriMet can, either work with community-based organizations or even just in our website, I guess provide the technology, the technology tools or resources that people may need to be connected in sort of a digital way, because I know that sometimes our resources might be limited, but again, I think this is where we can try to leverage what's great about meeting online and using whatever's available in the digital universe to really gain more feedback from different stakeholders.
Great, thank you. I want to see if either John Gardner or Bernie wants to respond to this, because I can kind of talk around it, but I can't claim to be the expert on our overall strategy. In terms of engagement with the business plan, obviously we have the review period during which any and all people can respond to it, and we go to TIAC and we go to CAT and we try to reach out to stakeholders, but a lot of it really leverages our overall outreach and engagement that we do. John or Bernie, would you?
John, can you go on? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think Director Way is correct. It's sort of like this new normal is requiring us to think differently about engagement, and we're not the only ones. This is true for all public agencies. I'll be excited to see what feedback we get and what learnings we have for the current reimagining public safety conversation, because we've asked partners to engage their communities using what other methods they can use that make sense for their communities. So in addition to sort of software tools or just phones or whatnot, we'll hear a lot more about what they're doing. And then that will allow us to meet them sort of in the middle and use the levers that they know are working, because they're closer to the field or to the ground or to the community than we are. So I think we're going to know a lot in the next 30 to 45 days, and it's going to inform what we do going forward, both in terms of engagement around the budget conversation or future service conversation. So I think Director Way is correct that we need to continue to stretch ourselves and look for new ways, especially during these times, to make sure people's voices are part of the process.
And I would just expand on that and say that this has been something that we're learning and changing over time. It used to be that we would hold town halls and invite people to come, and if 2 or 3 people showed up, that was okay. When the House Bill 2017 process came into place, we really doubled down on how to be more proactive about reaching out, particularly to communities that aren't typically engaged in the traditional public involvement processes. And one of the tools that we're using with the work that John is doing that we piloted in that House Bill 2017 effort is really going to community-based organizations that have client bases and doing two things. One is putting them in the lead on the public outreach. You know, instead of asking them to find people to come to our forum, us giving them the information and asking them to hold the forum. And we find that's a lot more successful. And then finding ways to compensate people for attending, because we know that a lot of the folks in low income, particularly low income communities, but also minority communities, have difficulty, you know, with daycare, with you know, working multiple jobs and language barriers and so forth. So we started feeding folks. We started, you know, giving out Fred Meyer gift cards. And all of those tools have really started to bear fruit, and we're seeing a lot more direct involvement from folks at a very grassroots level, and that's paying dividends in the work that John's talking about. And I think we want to carry that model forward as we do other work with the community around service planning and other changes that the agency is contemplating. We now have those tools and those relationships that will bear fruit in the future.
Thank you. I have been very impressed by, I think, the growth of community-based organizations and nonprofits that I think John and his team has really grown in the last year or so with more input. So thank you for that work. I think just my last comment is just working with the House of Population as well. I know that we you know, deeply care about, again, folks who are not able to have stable housing for whatever reason. And I feel like that is oftentimes a population that gets, you know, really underserved by transit and by so many other institutions, right, that they may come across. And so, again, it'll just be interesting just how we continue to engage the houseless community as well. And I know we'll be talking about fare evasion also later in the presentation. So again, I think this is also a particular group that is also impacted by some of the things that we're doing. Thank you.
Good. Director Bellman, you've been patiently waiting with your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, so, you know, as you dig into this document with the COVID and the economic impacts on the business plan, there really are just a broad array of initiatives that are being either delayed or extended by the financial impacts. And I wrote down a few of them: the transit-oriented development, some IT improvements, including for communications with customers, developing a carbon lens for planning, the Columbia Bus Garage, transit-oriented development. So those are some really broad impacts on some really important initiatives. And my question is, do we have any kind of prioritization as the financial picture improves, or if it improves more quickly than we currently expect? Kind of, have we prioritized which of these many initiatives we want to kind of get online first?
Yeah, let me start with that, and then I invite Doug or Dee or anybody else to weigh in as well. My answer from the perspective of business plan development is the prioritization. I mean, that's why we're going through this process, right? For now, it's things like we need to, obviously, culture of safety underpins everything, equity approach underpins everything. But when we start thinking about individual efforts, you know, what supports our points of emphasis in the business plan? What supports our goals and objectives best? And which things do we believe that we can really meaningfully carry forward and continue kind of regardless of the circumstances? So part of the answer to that actually comes as we develop the business plan for this next coming year, partially guided by this conversation that we're having right now. I guess I would add, and then see if Doug or anybody else wants to add in. Clearly, you know, you mentioned a couple things like Columbia Bus Garage. Well, that was a really high priority when we expected ridership and service growth the way it was pre-COVID. Now, yes, we will get there, but it's not quite as urgent. And so those kinds of things can actually, because the world has changed, can actually not quite go on the back burner, but can be reprioritized behind other things that still must go forward.
Laura, is that answering or starting to answer your question?
That is, thank you. Yeah, I mean, certainly from my point of view, the initiatives around greenhouse gases, you know, carbon lens, electric vehicles, I think those should be a pretty high priority as our financial condition permits. So, but yeah, thank you. I'd be happy to hear if anybody else has comments on prioritization.
Sure, and there's no stepping away from those specifically, but always that question mark on what's the opportunity cost when we put limited resources into those. And I think what we're flagging with that is it may change the timing, it doesn't change the commitment. Doug, did you want to add to that? We can't hear you.
Sorry, I guess I have two mute buttons, so I guess a double safety measure for everybody else. So I think, Alan, that's right. I think some of this is market driven. TOD is very market driven, external driven. That's not to say there's an immense amount of work still going on in TOD, but the deals will only flourish as we have our private sector and our external partners able to pull them off. So, but we've got a lot of work to still do behind the scenes before when they become ripe or ready to do the deal per property. So you'll probably see that that's not uncommon that TOD gets extended in downturns in economies. So you also want to make sure we do good deals, not just impulsive deals where we end up picking the pieces up on the other side because the private sector partner couldn't pull off what they said they did. And to the other one is where demand is down, you know, the 50% level, that, you know, we have to be careful that we're trying to return to base service before we accelerate up expansion. So I think somewhere in there is, and that's where the Columbia bus base fits in. So the team is updating I'll call the demand numbers of riders, let alone the demand numbers that buses, in this case, that have to support that. So, and behind that is in fact the Columbia bus base. So it is still, we own it, we're still going to develop it. It's just the pace of A, affordability, and B, the needed demand that supports the speed of that development in combination. So the GHG electrification part, or GHG or maybe hydrogen in the future, but never discount that out yet. I think those are things we're still going to progress on. But I think we are going to have to look at the speed of that progression based on demand of particularly the new service line. As we get to electrify existing fleet, because some fleet, we may have to run the fleet a few more years than we'd anticipate. So those are things where our average age right now is about 8-9 years on the bus fleet. It was around 15, 16, 17 years. We've really reduced that significantly in the last several years here as we modernize. So, but the remainder of the back fleet, that's where we want to continue to get to electrification as much as possible. The Powell Garage project, which is going to be electrified, that continues. So an immense amount of work still going on in it. The carbon lens is beyond the bus fleet though. And I think that's areas where some can be accelerated or the timing may be different, but the carbon strategy is still going to retain, to Alan's point. So.
Okay. I'm looking for any other hands raised on this part of this. I want to make sure we get to your points of emphasis here for fiscal year 2022. So maybe we ought to wander into that one if you think this is a good time, a good segue to get to that. Okay. So Alan, do you want to go to that document?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm turning back on my sharing again, and this is just the one page that, well, I have a Word version up here, but in your packet, I think is on the electronic page 17, or maybe it's 16.
I think it's the third attachment. Alan, I think it's the third attachment on our Nextcloud. Just the one page as you said.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, I'm sorry, I have not seen it in the version that you've seen. I just have it as a single PDF all crunched together. So this is just the one page, and what we've done is, I think a couple of years back, we introduced the points of emphasis as what are we really thinking top of mind as we go into the year, and then we mark the specific key strategic actions that really address these points of emphasis, and that helps us prioritize those over other efforts when kind of push comes to shove and we have to choose one over the other. So what I thought I'd do is very briefly just run through these and then open it back up to thoughts and comments, and then we'll bring you into the end of this agenda item at 10 o'clock. So you see the 4 categories: customers, internal business practices, people and innovation, and financial. And the idea, obviously, with a list of points of emphasis for a year is there can't be too many, because if everything's a priority, then really nothing is a priority. But the ones that, taking everything we know so far about what's happened this year and what we expect to happen next year, and then working through mostly with the executive team, we've come up with this, what you're looking at as a draft for going into this, and open to further comments and edits and changes as needed. So under customers, the first thing, maybe most obvious, is ridership and recovery strategies. This used to be focused around, responding to growing demand. While we're in a reset period where our demand has reduced significantly, we expect over the years that will grow back up, but we really have to be, very much responding to demand and making sure that we are tailoring our service levels and keeping our costs at a point where we're addressing that demand. And then that also means restoring service if and when it makes sense on those lines that are most likely to attract returning and new ridership, so that we can really support that recovery in terms of ridership. The second one on here is around the reimagined safety and security. We're doing the reimagining right now, and so by the time we get to FY22, we will be in the implementation and finalization stage, and that's why this is worded the way it is. The third here is also recognizing that, our ridership has changed so dramatically, and it also ties back into the shift that we were using in sort of philosophy of, we are a transit provider, we are also a mobility manager, an agency that connects people to mobility options. That may be direct transit service, that may be something else. And when we only think about providing transit service, then one of the best measures of success is the number of boardings. But if we are a more fully rounded mobility manager, we may count as a success the fact that we help somebody get on a bike, or we help somebody find their way to a park and ride, and other improvements to the individual's experience, that the economic opportunities that are afforded by mobility, and also to the benefits, environmental and social, that accrue to our community. None of those necessarily fully captured in ridership. And so this is about looking for other ways to understand that. And we do have efforts around that. And also specifically recognizes the carbon emissions, the benefit that reducing carbon emissions brings, but it recognizes that there may not be a one-to-one between ridership and that as well. In the next section, the IT strategic plan, which is essentially complete and now is in implementation, will be in implementation for the next few years. That's a necessary underpinning to the capability of staff to deliver important items up on behalf of the agency and for the community, and therefore that as a point of emphasis for the coming year. The next one, we talked about this a lot already, but I'll reemphasize, enhancing equity for employees. So continuing to implement the recommendations from the Employment Diversity Review, but also conducting an externally based organizational, or sorry, I think that should say internally based organizational cultural survey, and develop a related strategic plan to really understand how are our employees experiencing the experience of being within our agency. Are we, where are we being inclusive, and where do we still have a lot to do, and what should we do about that? Also related to people and innovation is that resource management, developing strategies to align resources to our available financial capacity, knowing that what we heard from Dee will be the financial reality for the next few years. How do we be as efficient as we can with those as possible? And then under financial specifically, financial resiliency, planning for and responding to economic volatility, really trying to be as proactive as we can in this uncertain period. And then with the capital program, being being careful about that, continuing with those items that are either largely externally funded, large capital projects that need to go forward, key state of good repair replacements, and also keeping a sharp eye on the T2020 ballot measure and being responsive to that. We'll know well before we have to finalize the draft of the business plan what the outcome of that was, but obviously that will have a big impact on some of our efforts around capital program going forward. So that's the hopefully quick summary, and with that I just invite additional comments, thoughts, emphases, directions from all of you.
Great, thank you, Alan. I see Director Simmons has her hand up.
Yes, I have a question for Doug, and it has to do with the IT strategic plan. A couple of years ago when I toured the command center, it became evident that there were limitations in our current technology, being able to track another light rail system, and we've been extending routes for buses, and have we had, what is entailed in the IT strategic plan that, is it more administrative operation? It was my understanding that we actually need to procure a whole new system to be able to expand service through the command center at that time.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this is the organization's first ever IT strategy actually that we've just completed, and it's really extensive, and it actually covers not only what you say, because you're right, there is the operating system that moves trains and dispatches and such. It's at its capacity, and in some parts of it, because it's multi-segmented, some of it's end of life. So the Southwest Corridor project, should it be successful, not only through T2020, but the culmination of state and federal support, let's say we can pull the deal off, the $3 billion deal, in it will be a requirement to upgrade that's fundamental capacity. So that would be the trigger to address what you just suggested. Underneath it, we have still capacity to run the red line expansion. So there's still oxygen, if you will, and capacity underneath that for some more train cars and such. So we're okay there for the next number of years. But in the IT strategy, there is a shortage of staff and leadership. So part of what's we're deploying this year is the hiring up of some more competency and investing in competency, because everyone's been running so hard, so fast, and there's balls dropping. Cybersecurity is just a classic example of that everybody would probably see pretty quick. So we have some cyber investment, but we've got more resources in cyber to invest, for example. Other examples include a modernization of many of our programs. Many have been, the agency does an inordinately large amount of internal software support and programming. We want to start evolving away from that and getting off the shelf things as part of our strategy, getting more where it economically makes sense to the cloud. It's a lot cheaper. Now, the cloud has different risks. It doesn't mean because you send it to the cloud, the risk disappears. So we're going to be taking each part and saying what should go to the cloud, what shouldn't. And then and a great example of quite a large initiative is our software program related to the whole train and bus maintenance program. We've had an internally one. It's called MMIS for buzzwords, Management Maintenance Information System. It's long past its tooth, so we have age. We need to go out, and we're underway now to go through a whole reassessment and procurement process related to that itself. So you could probably take 100 to 200 types of programs like that of an agency of this size and complexity, and we're gonna have to work all of them through based on what the company can financially digest, what risk-wise we can actually handle, because risk in IT becomes really important, and the age of its life cycle. Some products are not supported anymore, as we know with IT, they run out. So there's a whole confluence of moving elements to this over quite a number of years. And we're also going to look internally as one of the recommendations in terms of not a board governance side, but an internally oversight by executive of how we should structure the IT oversight, what projects come where, when, and how. So we put a closer thumb on the outcomes we need from IT. Did that answer your question?
It does, and because it's a huge undertaking, and it's very, very expensive. And I remember state of good repair, and having to delay finding a software solution using the internal solution because of the demand for resources in other areas of the agency. So this is something that has to be a priority moving forward.
Yeah, you're quite right. And if we do this right, I mean, sometimes the IT strategies always come back because it's always convenient to have 5-year plans. My own experience on IT transformation is more like 7 to 10 if you get really real about it, for a variety of reasons, because there's only so much an organization can digest, because many of these systems interface together strategically. And so I look at this as a 7 to 10 year evolution, and at the heart of it is an opportunity of culture change, to use technology to help you enhance, get the waste out of there, and where people feel very empowered to do things in highly efficient ways. So I see it as, I'm actually quite excited about this long term.
As a board, I mean, we see the community's desire to have more service and to make it more reliable, more convenient, and from their standpoint in technology, they don't always ship to better service, and it's a critical component to that.
Yeah, I think it's a really astute comment. It's typically your iceberg photograph where the customer sees above, but 3/4 of it's actually below. But there are things that through the IT, it is not just below the iceberg part. It is hugely transformative. But there's a part of this that is products and services related. So, for example, we just received a federal grant for I think it's about $1.2 million, or a couple $1 million project. We're working with Visa and others in a strategic alliance right now on looking at how we modernize plan, book, and pay is the step to ultimately get to that. So we're helping pioneer that only for our agency, but actually to share it with the industry itself. So though there's a new products and services side to IT strategy, which will be part of it. We're also looking, and through Shelley Devine's really capable work and others, we're actually getting ready shortly to come out with a headset tour. We've actually been in the recording studio, so to speak, and we're going to be coming out sharing a headset tour. How do you take your fixed asset and leverage it when ridership have capacity to tie it into education, to position our brand into education and learning? New immigrants very much come to urban centers and use transit a lot of times to learn the region and the city they may be living in, as well as, so we think there's a tourist side to this, and maybe over time a revenue generation side to this, as we see in our finances. We have to come up with new ways to ensure our relevance. And there's a product piece to this as well. So I think the hop card is a strategic foundation that the board many years ago made a great decision on. It's now, how do we make that sweat? I'm in discussions right now around how do we join forces between other transit agencies. And so you can use a hop card when you get to the airport in Seattle on Sounder, and the same hop card kind of here, or Hawaii, those types of things between agencies that help drive usage. So there's a products piece as well to that. Yeah.
All right, Linda, are you done? Okay. Keith.
I had a note that I wanted to add onto the people and innovations piece. I just want to make sure that wasn't being overlooked, that we want to make sure that we include gender identity issues as well, as far as women and LGBTQI folks, not to leave them out of the equation, because certainly they have issues and concerns as well, and may have issues that are pertinent to that discussion.
Great, thank you. Yeah, certainly racial issues is top of mind given the national environment, but that's absolutely critical. The point is, we are trying to be welcoming to all, both for our customers, but also for our own employees, so that we all feel included and can do our best work on behalf of the region.
Great. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you.
Any other board members want to chime in right at this moment? Not hearing it. I have a couple, 2 or 3 comments for you. First off, thank you. This is good. The points of emphasis, it says for 2022, but I think you also mentioned that a number of these priorities are working on right now and will be for the remainder of this fiscal year. And I guess I just point out that I am extremely interested, or maybe it's almost worried about the ridership recovery and how we actually get back to levels we want to be, not only recovering where we were pre-COVID, but also how we actually, get to the next paradigm shift in terms of really increasing our ridership. So I want to explore that one a bit more in some time, about how we actually, what strategies and what we're going to entertain to actually bring people back and encourage them to get back on the system, and then obviously to do it in a big way, which is a longer term and many-year effort. But I just worry about riders that we may have lost forever if we don't really take an aggressive an outreach or whatever we need to do to get them back and grow as we want to, and the region needs us to grow. So I mean, that's comment one. I don't know whether you want to comment on that, Doug or Alan, but that's just a real worry I have.
Yeah, I think it's a I call them wake mares. They're not nightmares, but they're not dreams either. So this is on my list as well, President Warner. Bernie and JC and team have been working extensively on this piece, and we will bring this back to the board specifically here in the next, I'm going to say, I don't know if it'll be right for November, but likely December type of board meeting as a briefing. And so this is a really important piece here, because if the ridership's not coming, we have to size our business accordingly down to the essential service level at the end of the day. So this is a really foundational piece for this agency. And it's a lot of times in our world, we're really good at what we can control, but this is a customer-centric one. It's not just a build and they will come. I think the agency and the industry is going to have to become more marketing-oriented, not just communications-oriented. And we're going to have to likely to find precious dollars to invest in outreach. The topics like loyalty, I gave example of the headset tour, other ways that we haven't contemplated maybe before, and accelerate some of those things up to go after, example, e-bikes. Instead of looking at the last mile, e-bikes give you last miles. give the orbit where people can connect to transit because of electric bikes. They can travel hills that they never even contemplated before in really efficient ways. So I think there's examples where there's some markets maybe changing, to your point, people not traveling like they used to, they work from home. Conversely, how do we go after some of these new markets that I think we have to get our head around? So we will bring that back to the board because you're quite right. It's critical.
Yeah. And just to follow up a little bit further, I mean, my belief is there's a lot of people that probably just don't want to get back on transit because of their fears about safety with COVID. And so, what are we going to be able to do, and how do we actually allay some of those fears and get people back? So again, I look forward to that as a robust and good discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, good one.
And then the other comment I would make is for the rest of the board, if you remember, we were doing Doug's performance review. I did send to you his first shot of the general manager objectives for fiscal year 2021. I will point out that Keith and I have been talking about some changes to that, and Doug has made some changes to reflect, again, emphasis in terms of ATU relationships, management to ATU relationships, and again, the whole issue about cultural competency, equity, diversity within TriMet, and again, getting some outside view of our culture and how we're doing it. And so as I get that done with Keith a little bit, I'm going to send out another version of this, and I'd like to get the focus on this and get the board to say, yeah, this looks like the things we ought to use as emphasis for the next year. And obviously this is a big piece of that. It's already, most all of this is in Doug's draft to date. So I will get that back out to you, and then I'll do some follow-up because I think this is a perfect segue to getting that going too. And Doug, I don't know whether you have anything further you want to add on that, but I want to thank you for being flexible and working with us.
No, I think you captured it nicely. So I think, and those are very appropriate topics. So very much supported.
I see Kathy Way's hand is up now, so prompted something there.
Yes, it did, Bruce. I think you just, I think you said it right, which is how do we regain ridership? And I'm thinking particularly around folks who work in downtown because, I would say 90% of folks who, traditionally take the MAX to work in our downtown core, they're just not doing that anymore because of COVID. So this is just a comment, but I would also be very much interested in seeing any conversations around some of those companies or some of those workplaces reopening and how that could also impact the ridership conversation. But I think this is happening all across America. So, it's not just in downtown Portland, right? This is a total shift, I think, in our workplace environment and our habits and in commuting. So I think it would also be great to bring in some maybe some national perspectives into this, or also find out how other places, but particularly downtowns all over, all over the United States are also sort of dealing with the loss in ridership. So it's definitely something that I think we need to consider.
Good comments, Kathy. I agree with you. And I think we probably are going to be needing to get out of the box we're in terms of thinking about the future, just because there are some big changes that have occurred, and probably some of them, as you point out, may never come back the way we thought they were, to the way they were in the past. And so we need to use some information and get smart on this, because I think we're all going to be learning. Well, Alan, how we doing?
Good. Maybe just to underscore what you just said, before COVID, we are, I think we're the 24th largest metropolitan area in the United States, but we were about 10th in terms of ridership. So we have outperformed in terms of ridership compared to many of our other peers. And we don't have complete numbers post-COVID, but the anecdotal stuff we've heard seems to indicate that we've lost either in keeping with or perhaps lost less than many of the other peers around the nation. That doesn't mean we can, sing our own praises. That means that we need to be even more innovative about how we push for new ridership in the future and expand all of those benefits, like I was talking about, not just ridership, but other ways to help reduce congestion, reduce greenhouse gases, and get people the economic activity and access and opportunity that people are looking for. So all of that, the comments very much appreciated, and very much I think it's top of mind for a lot of us, the need for us to be innovative and look for those sort of almost phase shifts in how we attract ridership and what kinds of services and how we provide our service to be able to do that. So really appreciate the comments. Oh, I guess I should also say that, we know there is some perception out there about the safety of transit and COVID, and yet everything we see in terms of research and experience from other places around the world says that transit is a pretty good place to be under COVID. There have not been a number of cases traced back to transit ridership, and especially with our cleaning and efforts in place, I think people can feel some confidence being on TriMet.
I agree. Well, what I want to note for Travis that it's 10 o'clock on my watch, and we're right
If I could just jump in for just one moment on Alan's last comment. Are we making sure that we're getting that information out there, that that we are safe and secure in regards to COVID, and we've had a great track record, so that folks will start feeling a little bit more comfortable?
I'm going to have to defer to others about our external communications. I think we've been communicating about our cleaning protocols and mask requirements and things like that. But is there anybody who wants to weigh in on that?
Yeah, Alan, this is Bernie. I can jump in on that. Director Edwards, yes, that has been pretty much our only message during the last 5 or 6 months. We have, until recently, we were limited to, we were required to have 6-foot distancing between passengers, and that really limited the number of folks that we could accommodate on the system, even running at 80% of normal hours. So we weren't promoting ridership a lot at that point. In fact, our communication was to please reserve the seats on the vehicles for essential personnel such as nurses and other folks who needed to get to work, because we were seeing pass-ups leaving people on the side of the road that we couldn't accommodate on the vehicle because of the 6-foot distancing. Now that we've gone to 3-foot distancing, we're seeing a big drop-off in pass-ups, and so we're just beginning the process of starting to encourage people to come back to the system, but we're cautious in trying to match that up with the capacity, because even at 3 feet, we still have some limits on how many folks we can get on each vehicle.
Bernie.
Good. All right, now I'm going to declare victory on this conversation. And so we're now a couple minutes behind time, but I think we've got scheduled now a break for about 15 minutes, and I assume everybody would like to have a little break. Is that right? So why don't we reconvene at, well, let's just say, why don't we come back at 10:15? That'd be a 13-minute break. That work for everybody? Okay, let's assume we get right back at 10:15. Thank you.
Thank you, President Warner. Present and accounted for.
Okay. So who am I turning this over to now?
Doug, did you want to do any introduction of this, or do you just want me to launch in?
Since I'm not hearing him, go ahead, Bernie.
Okay, great. Well, so over the last couple of years and intermittently over the history of TriMet, actually, the idea of a free system has come up, and at different times, folks have different rationales for that. We did have a fareless square in downtown Portland at one time, and TriMet was one of the first transit agencies in the country to try that experiment, and others followed. And so I wanted to take a little bit of time and just review kind of our thinking and assessment of the benefits and costs of a fareless system, and then sort of talk about the experience that others have had, and sort of our perspective on whether that makes sense or not for TriMet. And so, by the way, if you're following with the materials that were sent out, I've changed the order and modified a couple of slides. So don't get confused if things aren't flowing in your packet exactly the way they are here on the screen. So here are the topics that I wanted to cover. Just review TriMet's existing fares and discount programs. Look at some of the other free systems around the country and how we compare with those. Talk a little bit about, from our perspective, who would benefit from a free system in the TriMet case, assuming that there wasn't an offsetting increase in resources from outside the agency. Look at where our customers are in terms of their priorities relative to free service versus other things that attract riders to the system, such as expanded service. Touch a little bit on the Get Moving 2020 measure, which has a proposal for a youth transportation pass program, and then just touch on a couple of policy questions that come out of this overall discussion. So unless there are any questions about the topics, I'll go ahead and launch in and just let folks know I'm going to march forward. And so, and I can't, from the view that I'm looking at, I can't see hands raised. So I would just encourage folks to unmute and ask questions as we go along, interrupt me, and I'll be happy to answer any of those questions. So real quick review of TriMet's fare structure. We have no zone, so we have a one zone system. We used to have a multi-zone system where we charged, the farther you traveled, the more we would charge. We've changed that policy. It makes it simpler for the riders. There is an equity element to that, which is that folks who travel farther, they're subsidized by the folks who travel short distances. We made this change really after or midway through a lot of the gentrification that has pushed low-income families out of inner city neighborhoods. So the net result is that this change now really does benefit those lower income and minority households that are on the outskirts or the inner ring suburbs who have to travel farther distances to get to their destinations. Unlike a lot of cities, we don't have a differential for our light rail system. Many cities have a higher cost fare for their light rail systems. Those systems that have rail that goes to the airport, a lot of them charge additional for that. We don't. Some systems now charge peak hour pricing. This is kind of like congestion pricing for transit. We don't do that on our system. Our system is a flat fare across all hours. We offer a 2.5-hour transfer window. That's quite generous compared to most systems. Most systems max out at 2 hours. And the reason for that is that the transfer is really intended to provide for extending a one-way trip as opposed to allowing folks a two-way trip. And the 2.5-hour window actually does provide that you can take two trips essentially out and back on one fare. And then the thing that is really unique about our fare system is that we have fare capping. And that's only possible given the structure of our hop program where we store the value of the card at a central computer. It's not stored on the card, the physical card itself. It's stored at a central computer. And we can tell if you've tapped twice in a day. And your third ride then would be free. And we extend that fare capping over the course of the month. And so the cumulative effect of that is that if you're a regular rider, you can get up to 72% off of the cost of riding for the month, off the face value of a daily pass or a single ticket. In other words, you can buy a monthly pass one trip at a time. So we give you the volume discount of the month, even though you may not have the money at the beginning of the month to pay for an entire pass. And we're, if not the only transit system that allows that or provides that, we're one of only 2 or 3 in the country. Just a quick overview of what our fare revenue, this is actually last year, does not reflect COVID impacts. So it's more of a typical year. We have over $100 million in fare revenue that goes into the operating side of the account. Most of that, 85% of it, is adult fares. Just under 10% of it is honored citizens. And in our system, low-income fare and youth are lumped into the honored citizen category, but this is the revenue that comes from the elderly and disabled community portion of the honored citizen. About 4% comes from youth and $1 million from the LIFT program, and about $1 million from the low-income fare program. That's going up over time. The rest of these are relatively steady amounts, but the low-income fare, because of the recent implementation of that, is growing over time. If you look at our fare cost over time, we haven't really raised fares since 2020 or 2012. And in fact, for youth fares, we've reduced it. We reduced it by 40 cents in 2014. So our revenue, our cost of fare has been very, very stable and flat since 2009, essentially. If you look at like the City of Portland's water utility fee, which is also an essential service, it's climbed significantly over that same period of time. If you look at electrical costs in Oregon, those have also risen over time, another essential utility. So compared to other utilities, particularly essential utilities, we've maintained our costs for a long, long time without making any increases, and in fact, decreasing the youth fare. And if you think about it in inflation-adjusted terms, the buying power of those fares has gone down, and the cost to the individual has also declined as incomes have risen through inflation over time. Here's our fare structure compared to some of our peer agencies. These are transit districts that are similar in size and scope, have light rail as well as bus. And as you can see, we're on par with them in terms of our base fare at $2.50 per trip and $5 for a day fare. We're below Seattle, which is at $8. We're below Denver, which is at $10. We provide a substantial discount around our honored citizen program. So we're at $28, and all of the other peers are above that. We are very low on the low-income fare. The cost of our low-income fare program is very low compared to our peers, and that's on a par, obviously, with the honored citizen and youth. So our base fare is similar to what other districts charge, and our discounted fares tend to be lower than what other districts similar to our size charge. Down at the bottom, you'll see an average, which is a little bit lower than ours. That actually includes a lot of smaller agencies than we are. So I mentioned that we have pretty good discounting programs. We also have free programs, and I'll just run through those real quickly. We have more than 30,000 applicants or participants in our low-income fare program at this point. That's more actually than we thought we would get at this point in the development of that program, and it continues to grow over time. We think there are something like 80,000 or so folks who on paper qualify for the low-income fare program in the region. They may or may not apply because they may not use transit, may not be a mode that they want to use, but there's obviously a bigger universe of folks out there who could qualify for the low-income fare program if they decided to apply for it. We have age-based discounts. Children under 6 aren't charged. 7 to 17 get the youth fare. Seniors over 65 and those who are disabled qualify for that same discount. And the low-income program downtown, which is different from the low-income fare program, actually provides a pass that's $5 a year, and they sign up for it once every 2 years. That's a very small program, but it's when we eliminated Fareless Square downtown, we implemented that program to reflect the fact that there are folks in very low income situations in service programs downtown that still need to access services. And then obviously the disability-based program, which is the same as youth and seniors. In addition to those discounts, we have the Access Transit program, which allocates about $1 million in free passes. We distribute those through over 100 nonprofits in the region. And we also distribute about 1.2 million in discounted passes over the last 5 years to many of those same nonprofits. The Access Transit program was established in 2012 when we were doing a fare increase. It has a $1.2 million budget. We reduce tickets through those community-based organizations to their clients. Some of the community-based organizations further subsidize those passes, so there can be a mix of reduced cost or free, depending on how the community-based organization wants to use that benefit. We also make grants of up to $20,000 per CBO for them to distribute passes to their recipients. And then we do this, update the program on an annual basis. And I know you're not going to be able to read this, but in your packet, you have a slide that has this list of the community-based organizations that we work with. And it's really, really a broad cross-section of groups that work with the community, from Cascade AIDS Project to Centro Cultural to Right to Dream 2 and the Old Town Forest Grove Project. It really touches every corner of the region, and we're really proud of the relationship that we have with these organizations. One of the other discount programs that we have is our high school program. There's two components to this. One is a program that we call the Portland Public School model, but it's available to any any school district around the region. This was established by the TriMet board a number of years ago, and it essentially offers any school district that if the school district is interested in providing a universal pass to all of its high school students, then TriMet will discount our already discounted pass by an additional third. And TriMet will pick up that 1/3 of the cost of the face value of a student pass. And Historically, Portland Public Schools is the only district that has participated in that program. And the reason for that is that PPS high schools, PPS does not provide yellow bus service to its high school students. Under state law, it's the only district in the state that has an exemption from a yellow bus requirement. And they sought and received that exemption on the basis of the fact that TriMet provides equivalent service. What that state legislation did not do is solve the inequity that's created by that exemption, because high school students in other districts get yellow bus service for free, but high school students in Portland have to pay for their access to TriMet because the state does not give TriMet any resources to offset the cost of providing those passes. So PPS is able to participate in that program because they have cost savings from not providing yellow bus service. Other school districts outside of Portland have to provide the yellow bus service, and therefore they don't get any savings from an exemption, and so they don't have additional resources available to pay for the 2/3 of this program. The city of Portland did provide, historically, the city of Portland provided 1/3 of the cost of the PPS program, and the school district provided 1/3, and TriMet provided 1/3. The city of Portland, the city council 2 years ago elected to discontinue that program. They allocated a portion of those funds to David Douglas and Park Rose. And we did extend that program to those districts for 2 years using the city of Portland money, but that money has now run out or will run out at the end of this year. So we have that program, it's available, but it's not, other than Portland, it's not used. In addition, through the STIF program, which requires that 1% of STIF funds be allocated to a high school transportation program, we allocate about $500,000 a year to a student pass program that is allocated to school districts based on their population of students who qualify for free and reduced lunch program. So we take the total of free and reduced lunch populations in the region, we divide it by the high schools, and that gives them a factor. We apply that factor to the STIF funds and allocate the passes based on that factor. And then there are a number of schools around the district that don't apply for their allocated funds, and we recycle those resources back into the program for the neediest high schools, those that have the highest percentage of free and reduced lunch students. And then TriMet supplements that program with $200,000 of its own general fund resources. So the total program is about $700,000 a year. And then we do a number of other discounts. We have a summer scholars program where we provide about $200,000 in free passes to students during the summer so that they can complete their degrees. And a lot of those students are ones who will be completing their high school diploma over the course of the summer. And we really try to work with the districts to help them because we know once they leave the high school system, it becomes much more difficult for them to complete their degree. So we have, in addition to the $14,000 in the Portland Public Schools program, we have another $14,000 that we touch through these various programs. So a total of about 30,000 students altogether get some sort of additional discount on top of the student pass. I mentioned the low-income fare program. We have more than 30,000 enrolled. Our STIF expenditures are over $1 million now. Our program offers benefits to individuals who are at 200% or below the federal poverty level. That's a bit more generous than many of the low-income fare programs around the country. Many of them cap out at 150% of the federal poverty level. The discount is between 50 and 72%, depending on how much folks use. And we've partnered with social service organizations at 47 locations around the region to have them do the qualification for the program. So as they're qualifying their clients for their programs, they're also qualifying them for the low-income fare program so that individuals don't have to go through a two-step process. As I mentioned, we're in pretty good company as far as the low-income fare program. There's only a handful of agencies around the country that offer a comprehensive low-income fare program such as ours. The only one that's bigger is Seattle, and they have been in place for 5 years. And they're the only one that's as generous as our program is as well. And as you can see, some of these, like Minneapolis, they offer discounts, but they're limited to off-peak trips. And you'll find that with a lot of low-income fare programs that they limit to off-peak or certain days of the week and certain lines. Even some will restrict low-income riders only to certain lines, and we don't do that. It's for the entire system, including streetcar. So the idea of eliminating fares often comes up, and there's a perception that eliminating fares could result in significant savings to the agency because we no longer have the cost of collecting fares. And to some extent, that's true. We do have collection costs associated with collecting fare. We have fare boxes that we need to maintain and ticket vending machines that need to be maintained and so forth. And we have fare inspection staff. And back room, we have a money room where we count the collections. All told, that accounts for about $16 million in costs out of the $107 million that we collect in fare revenue. But we know from studying other districts that have tried free systems and our own experience with Fareless Square and the free rail zone that we won't be able to eliminate our fare inspection staff. They will go from fare inspection to code enforcement. In fact, that's one of the things that they do already. They don't spend all of their time on fare enforcement. They do a lot of work making sure that the system is safe and that folks are following the communitarian rules that allow the system to be welcoming to all users. Things like telling folks that they can't smoke on the system and asking them to leave the rail car or the bus if they do smoke. Making sure that we don't have folks drinking alcoholic beverages on the system and coming onto the system impaired and unable to follow the protocols and the rules of civil engagement on the system. So they don't just collect fares. And so we won't be eliminating the fare inspectors if we eliminate fares. What they'll do is they'll become more focused on code enforcement and security. And we know that we'll have to add security on the system. The other transit systems around the country that have tried free systems have encountered significant problems with behavior and unruliness on the system, and that drives other customers off of the system and makes them vulnerable. And we need to make sure that the system is safe for all users. And so we know that we would have to add additional security and that there would be additional maintenance costs on the system. So in essence, eliminating the cost of collecting fares is probably going to be a net neutral or even a net negative as we add more security to the system. So there isn't really a savings per se in eliminating fare revenue. In fact, there's a significant loss because of that $100 million that we currently collect. So what would happen if we had a reduction of $100 to $117 million in revenue? Well, Farebox is 20% about of our operating budget. So one way to think about it is that there would be pressure to reduce, financial pressure to reduce our operating expenses. That means less service. Now, we wouldn't necessarily take it all out of operations, as Doug was talking about the budget earlier. We have some other levers, like reducing the rate at which we buy new buses and replacement buses and do maintenance on the system. But there's obviously, it's just like not painting your house and not re-roofing your house. At some point, the roof leaks and you're creating more damage to the system than if you had done regular maintenance. So it's impossible for us to be able to move enough levers to take $107 to $117 million reduction in operating resources and not impact services. There would be a significant reduction in service hours that would have to accompany an unfunded loss of that magnitude. Another way to think about it in terms of scale is that equates to almost 20 years on average of what we use, what we do to try to expand the system. So that it's the equivalent of not expanding the system for almost 20 years. It's the equivalent in somewhere between 5 and 10 years of the cost of entirely replacing our diesel fleet with battery electric buses. And that it's double the amount of new resources that we receive under the House Bill 2017 program. And I just note the legal implications there is that House Bill 2017, as we discussed earlier, has provisions in it that prevent agencies from reducing their own effort. So if we were to reduce our fares, there would be difficulty in using House Bill 2017 funds to backfill for those lost dollars, because the expectation under that legislation is that the local effort will continue, including how much fares contribute to the services. So now turning to look at other free or partially free systems. There are lots of little websites on the internet that talk about how there are these many free systems around the country. And what happens is, if you look at those in a little bit more detail, what you find is most of them aren't really free. Most of them have a free line or a free area, like TriMet used to have a Fairless Square. Most of those systems have very limited free areas or free lines. There are 28 that are completely free. Overwhelmingly, those are tiny transit systems. They exist in cities the size of Tualatin in our area. Most of them are college or tourist towns. Breckenridge and Park City, a lot of them rely on a significant influx of people from outside the community, and the local tax base is relies on the sales tax, or like in Park City and Breckenridge, on the influx of tourism dollars to the community and hotel motel taxes. So very few have any significant robustness to their transit system. Most of them have on the order of about 8 bus lines. They run very infrequently. They have little or no evening service. They have little or no weekend service, and most of them are seasonal. So even in Corvallis, the system basically shuts down in the summertime when the college students are not there. And most of those free systems are funded through a city or county sales tax. And the trade-off here is that the additional ridership that's gained from a free system is made up in the fact that those people are traveling to stores and other destinations where they're spending money, and the local jurisdiction is recouping those costs through the sales tax. And in all these cases, the organizations are part of another entity. So they're part of a city or they're part of a county. So they get the benefit of those sales tax dollars funneled through to them to offset the free fare. This chart, I know it's going to be small for you, is just a graphical way of trying to illustrate the difference in scale between TriMet and the other free systems that are out there. A lot of people point to Kansas City and say, oh, it's free, it's free. The truth of the matter is that Kansas City has announced that they're going to be free as soon as they figure out how to pay for it. And so far, they haven't figured out how to pay for it. So I put them in kind of a lighter color here because, in fact, they're not actually a free system at this point. So in terms of all the relevant measures, the number of vehicle hours, the operating budget, the number of vehicles that we put out in maximum service, and the number of trips, TriMet is 300, 400, 500, 1,000% bigger than these other districts. There is no comparison between what we put out on a daily basis, the number of people that we serve, and the density of service that we have compared to those free systems. It's just they're not apples and oranges, they're atoms and planets in terms of their scale. There are a couple of systems around the country and around the world who have gone to free that are a little bit bigger and more along our scale: Denver, Colorado, and Austin, Texas. The results of those experiments are that they did see ridership increases. They saw significant security problems. The frontline staff, the operators, had extremely negative experiences with those systems because of the inability to provide security and safety for both the passengers as well as the employees. And because of those outcomes and the costs, those programs were discontinued within a year or two. Free systems generally have a very small percentage of their revenue that comes from the fare box, 3, 4, 5%, whereas we're in the 20% or higher range. Some systems have gone fareless because they are in a category under the federal rules that they actually get more federal resources if they get rid of their fares because they're poorer. TriMet is not in that category. If we get rid of fares, we simply lose money and we don't get any more federal resource to make up that difference. Most of those that have gone free have been accompanied by some kind of infusion of outside resource, a new tax, or the local jurisdiction, the city or the county, agreeing to fund them. In Corvallis, it was a utility tax that was levied on all residents of the city to pay for the free system. As I mentioned, most of them have found significant onboard behavior problems. Folks who are using the system not to get from point A to point B, but as a non-destination location to spend time on. And then one of the interesting things that one of the things you hear from proponents of free system is that you hear that the ridership goes up, and it's true, it does go up in most cases. In some cases, it goes back down and levels out at a level that's not a lot higher than previously, but in some cases, there's significant additional ridership. But studies that have been done on where that ridership's coming from are really interesting. What they found is that most of the new trips on transit are not coming from people who switch out of their cars and move to transit. Most of those new trips are coming from people who used to walk or bicycle, who are now taking transit instead. So a free system isn't a panacea in terms of reducing car usage or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's really just replacing, in most cases, people who are already taking an alternative mode and moving them from that other alternative mode over to transit. So I wanted to spend a minute and talk about who are the main beneficiaries of moving to a free transit system if that were to happen in TriMet's case. And this is assuming that there's no outside resource that is funding the move to a free system. It's assuming that we are having to absorb those costs internally. So the first thing that we would note is that 20% of our fare revenue comes from businesses and government contracts. So the biggest beneficiaries right off the bat of going to a free system are businesses and governments who pay for passes for their employees. 4% of our revenue is estimated to come from tourism. So again, one of the big beneficiaries is folks who are traveling from out of town to Portland. And then this is not a cumulative, there's some overlap with these first two numbers, but 25% of our customers are coming from households with incomes over $100,000 a year. TriMet is a very unusual system in the percentage of choice riders that we have. We have upwards of 75% of our riders are choice riders. In most big urban transit systems, you find, 60, 70% of the riders are transit dependent. Only the poor and those who don't have cars ride those transit systems. In Portland, we have a very different system. And so that's why you see this dynamic where a very large percentage of our ridership base have incomes over $100,000 and, can afford the $250 pass cost. And then I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail. Because reducing our revenue would lock in our existing transit service, we wouldn't be expanding service for many years into the future in order to offset that loss of revenue. One of the biggest winners in going to a free system are those folks who already have access to good transit services. So this is just a graph that shows the income distribution of our ridership. So roughly 50% have household incomes over $60,000 and 25% $100,000 or more. So this, you've seen this map before. This is census tracts that show density of low-income residents. And what you can see is that out in East Portland, east of 205, you have concentrations of low-income households, and also out in places like Forest Grove and Cornelius, Aloha, and in the Tigard, Tualatin area. And then this map shows the same thing, only the percentage of minority communities. And again, you see that concentration east of 205 and out in the Cornelius, Forest Grove, and Aloha areas. And then an interesting new piece of data that you haven't seen before is this is a quick analysis, and it's based on a snapshot. But what this shows is the TriMet lines that have seen the least decline in ridership during the COVID period. And those are in the dark colors here. And what this tells us is that these are the most transit dependent riders. These are folks who are riding during the midst of the pandemic and really have no other alternative to get around. And what you see is the exact same distribution east of 205, down in the McLaughlin corridor, Tualatin and Tigard, and then Forest Grove, Cornelius. And then finally, this is a heat map showing departures per week of TriMet services per square mile. So it's a transit intensity map. So the lighter the color here, the greater the intensity of service. And what you would expect to see is that downtown has very good service because we have a hub and spoke system that converges on downtown. And what you also see is the historical distribution of transit service in Irvington, Sabin, Northeast Portland, and in Southeast Portland as well. And what you see is less density of service out in East Portland. And that's for a variety of reasons. One is residents are not, the population density is not as great out there, so we get fewer rides per hour of service. So it's much more expensive for us to put service in those areas than in the other areas. The street network is not as robust, so we just don't have as many streets to run on. And historically, we have not had the resources to invest in additional hours out in those areas. So they receive fewer trips per square mile than the areas in the inner city. So if you were to freeze in place by reducing our ability to expand operating by eliminating fares, you would lock in that dynamic and prevent the agency from making the kinds of improvements in those areas that are part of our service enhancement plans and that we've been making over the last couple of years. And I know this is hard to see, but basically this blue bar is service density per square mile. And you see in Northeast Portland, very high density of service and low density of minority and low income residents. Same in Sunnyside and Richmond, very high density of service, low density of minority and low income communities. Rockwood, Gresham, low density of service, high density of low income and minority communities. Same in Gresham and Centennial, same in Beaverton. And so what this tells us is that if you lock in the existing system and prevent us from expanding additional service by taking away that $100 million of resource, it's going to tend to lock in this dynamic and not provide the additional service growth over time to those communities like Rockwood, Gresham, and Beaverton. That is part of our goal. That is part of our service enhancement plan and our House Bill 2017 service plan. So nextly, I wanted to go over what we hear from our customers, and this is based on our ANA surveys that we do every other year, which are scientifically based surveys. We survey 800 residents in the region, and 86% on average respond that the value of the TriMet fare is good, very good, or excellent. So they believe they're getting good value for the money that they're spending on a fare. In fact, 71% of customers who are at or below 150% of the federal poverty level say it's a good to excellent value as well. So even those with limited resources believe that the current fare is a good value for their money. And only 8% of those surveyed say that the cost of the fare is the reason they don't ride the system. So we believe that the cost of the fare is not a barrier to folks using the system. Well, what are the barriers? Well, if we ask our ANA recipients or ANA survey respondents, it's convenience, frequency, and reliability. Those are the three things that they want. Convenience typically means I want a service, I want a line near me that I don't have to walk a long ways to. Frequency obviously means more buses, and reliability means that the buses aren't breaking down and we're maintaining those buses on a regular basis. Those are the three things that actually drive ridership. We also did a series of outreach to very specific low income and minority communities as part of the House Bill 2017 outreach process. And we asked, you know, how would you like to spend a new dollar? Do you want more coverage, or do you want it to go to reducing the cost of the fare? And overwhelmingly, the response was, we want more coverage, more frequency, shelters at bus stops. Reducing fares was close to the bottom of the list as far as a priority for spending new dollars. And then one interesting thing that we do that is very unusual for transit districts is we survey our riders who are not paying their fares. We go out and ask folks if they haven't paid their fare, why? And a quarter of those surveyed say, I could afford the fare. It's not an issue of money. I just decided to take a chance because I didn't think you were going to check. Only 2.4% of those who don't pay their fare say that it was because they couldn't afford it. And then just a real quick snapshot of TriMet's own experience with free systems. If free fares were going to generate additional ridership, we would expect the elimination of free fares to show a significant decline in ridership, and that hasn't been the case. When we ended Fairless Square, there was no decline in ridership. And when we ended the free rail system, there was also no systemic ongoing decline in ridership. There was a little blip right after the end of free rail, but the agency, the overall trajectory of ridership didn't change based on the change in the free system. And actually, in 1998, the then mayor of Portland, Vera Katz, asked TriMet to look at whether we could go to a free system. And we had an external consultant to do an analysis for us, and they concluded that it didn't make sense to go to a free fare system for most of the reasons that I've already listed. But they did make some recommendations about how fares could be restructured to make the system more accessible. And their recommendations were that we reduce the complexity of the system and eliminate zones, that we find a way to make paying fares easier and reduce the need for exact change, that we market and expand the employee pass programs, and that we expand youth programs and find ways to make it easier for youth to ride the system. And since that report, we've done all those things. We've eliminated zones. The HOP program makes accessing the system easier. You don't have to have exact change, and you get fare capping. We've expanded the employee programs significantly over the years, and we've made the changes to the youth program. We reduced fares. We've got the PPS program and the STIF resources. What wasn't contemplated in that study, but two additional steps that we've taken that have made the system more accessible, is we have the low-income fare program now and the $1.2 million in access transit benefits that we provide. So all of that is the context in which we conclude that a free system doesn't make sense, particularly if it's not funded from the outside. If it is funded from the outside, I think we would still tend to want to take any additional resources, scarce resources, and put those towards expansion of service rather than reducing fares, just because we know that's what our riders want and what equity demands. But we are looking at ways to respond to the request for access for youth. And that's included in the Get Moving 2020 measure that will be on the ballot this November. Metro approached us about whether we could approach that element of the ballot measure in a way that allowed it to cover more students than it would if we were charging them the face value of the passes. So if you take the 80,000+ high schoolers in the region that Metro wanted to cover through the measure and charge them for an annual pass, the face value of that would be something in the neighborhood of $19 million. Metro wanted the program to fit in a $9 million cost envelope. And so what we did was we did an analysis of the number of taps that we would expect high schoolers to make with their HOP cards over the course of a school year, and then analyze that based on the differences between high schools. Some high schools have a higher percentage of low-income students. Some high schools have less. Some high schools are near transit stops. Some don't have as robust a service. And we proposed a pretty innovative and new approach to charging Metro for the cost of a youth program, and it's based on an expectation about the number of taps that the program would experience. And we were able to get that program within that $9 million envelope. And it assumes that the PPS program continues and that the 700,000 of STIF allocation still continues. So all told, we'd have between 85 and 90,000 students with free annual passes under that program. It's a trial because we would need to recalibrate after a year or two to see how many taps are actually generated. The cost is based on a model, and we would need to validate that model and see where we end up. And what TriMet has done in that agreement with Metro is not only to agree to try this new way of charging, but we're also agreeing to take on some of the additional costs that we know are going to come if that measure passes that won't be covered by Metro's allocation to us. We know that Farebox only covers 20 to 25% of the cost of operating the system. To the extent that we add additional service, if there's additional maintenance or additional security that's required because of the additional student usage, that's all going to be borne by the agency rather than paid for out of Metro's student fare program. And we do spend a significant amount of money on additional trippers to reduce crowding during peak hours. And one of the things that you hear is that, you know, students can ride. There's no additional cost to TriMet from students riding because there are empty seats. Well, that's just not true. Students ride during the peak hours in the morning and the peak hours in the afternoon, and, you know, are on crowded buses where we have to add additional capacity or we have people passed up. And if we are going to, at some point, serve the suburban high schools that are currently not well served, we know there's an expense to that as well. So, and that's not covered by Metro's program. So what I'm trying to convey here is that TriMet has done a lot to meet Metro halfway on the cost of a high school program as we've reached agreement on this. So in conclusion, our analysis is that really there are no similar transit systems around the country that are free. There's just no comparison in terms of the robust level of service that we provide and the ubiquity of service that we provide compared to those free systems. Moving to a free system substantially benefits the business community and tourists and households that have significant income. And that doesn't really benefit our efforts to improve the equity of the system. It doesn't shift people from cars to transit based on the experience of other cities. All the data that we have suggests that our current customers and potential customers want more service. That's what they believe will bring them to the system, not fares. Fares are not the barrier to new people riding the system. And we've taken a lot of steps over the years to make the system more affordable and accessible to those with limited means. So even though the fare has not gone up, we've taken steps to make the barriers to riding lower. And even in the event that there were outside funding, TriMet believes that expanding service is the best use of those funds because it allows us to access those low-income and minority communities that are not in the central city, whose service today is less than we would like it to be or is not available at all. And if there are circumstances like the T2020 measure, where there's a targeted group that the community feels needs additional benefit, then and there's outside resources available, then by all means we're interested in working with that outside resource to try to target those groups and benefit those groups in a way that is equitable and doesn't detract from our ability to serve those very important and underserved communities in East Portland, in the McLaughlin corridor, in Aloha and East Beaverton, or West Beaverton, and Forest Grove and Tigard and Sherwood that we're seeking through our service enhancement plans to improve service to. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
First off, thank you very much, Bernie. That was a very complete report. And I think I see a couple folks. I see Keith and Kathy have their hands raised. Keith, do you want to start?
Compliment Bernie. Thank you very much. Very comprehensive report. That was very informational, and I appreciate the time and energy that was put into it.
Did you have a question, Keith? No. Okay.
I just had a comment.
Well, it's a good comment. Director Way?
Yes. Hi, Bernie. Thank you so much for putting together this this presentation. You know, I feel like sometimes when we hear free or fairless, people kind of freak out a little bit, right? Because it's like, oh no, like what's happening? What's going on? So I really appreciate you and your team just putting some more extra work into really trying to just unpack this for us to even see, you know, if this is something that we could potentially do in future years. So so I'm very much intrigued. I think I, you know, personally feel like when I think about providing full accessibility to all riders, that you know, this can potentially be a strategy to increase ridership. So and also address climate change and right, just get more people to take transit. So I guess my first question is, you cited some research where you found that fairless systems didn't increase ridership. So I would love to look at that research. If you can, you know, send that over a report. I just want to be able to figure out why, because I feel like for me it's a little bit counterintuitive to some of the things that I've been looking into. So that'd be great if you could just, you know, send us just some research. The second piece is, I agree. I don't think we can ever have a completely free system where no one pays. It needs to be a system that, if it does happen, needs to be heavily subsidized. I guess my question is, what are we hearing from the business community? I ask that because I think, you know, as taxpayers, we are already paying a lot of income tax, right? And we know that in Oregon we have a very low threshold for business tax. So I guess, what are we hearing from the business community in terms of maybe their support or maybe their opposition towards something like this, because I think this also goes back to treating transit as a utility, which again I think is another level of conversation. And then just the third question or point that I wanted to raise is, I think we are, this is just my personal take, but I feel like we are maybe setting ourselves up for a false dichotomy by saying we have to have fares, and if we don't have fares, then there's no way that the service can increase. And I feel like if we are already setting ourselves up for that, you have to have this or you're not going to have this, then I feel like it's already creating an inequitable system. So that's just my comment as to why we're connecting those two pieces so exclusively. So just, again, just comment question. And then just my last piece is around the 1998 study. So that was about 22 years ago, or 2 decades. And I was just reflecting back on to Director Gonzalez's point about having research. You know, I think it's one thing to have surveys and focus groups, and those are all great, but I think it's another thing to have some really updated research that we can, as a board, you know, really, I think, continue to conceptualize, analyze, bring us into the new century that we're in, rather than, you know, something that was written about 20 years ago. So just curious as to how some of those things are landing with you. And that was like 4 or 5 things. So I apologize if I rambled a little bit, but.
No problem. I think I got all of them. So I didn't mean to leave the impression that free systems don't see additional ridership. Most of them do see additional ridership. Some of them see that ridership spike right after it becomes free and then decline back to something close to what they had before it went free. But most of them do see additional ridership. What I was trying to convey is that when for those places that have analyzed it, what they've found is that car traffic and ownership doesn't decrease. It continues to grow. And so where the ridership comes from is from people who were riding bikes or walking previously. And they move to transit instead of people who were driving previously moving to transit. And that's pretty common and jibes with a lot of the analysis that we've done over the years, that the people who are most likely to be transit riders are also people who walk or bike as an alternative mode. So the universe of folks who don't drive tend to move between modes more fluidly than people who drive. It's what the research shows is that the cost of transit is a much less powerful tool in moving people out of their cars to alternative modes than the cost of driving. If you change the cost of driving and increase it by tolls or increase parking or increase gas taxes, that moves people from their cars into transit much more effectively than reducing the cost of transit does. So the elasticity of price for car users versus transit users is different. The question about the business community and the tax. So recall that you know, most of our operating resource comes from a payroll tax. So the payroll tax on the businesses will be 8/10 in 2026. It's slowly ratcheting up from 7/10 and change to 8/10 over a 10-year period. So each year we get 1/100% more on the employer payroll tax than we did the year before. So I think the business community would say, and has said to us, that, hey, we already pay, you know, this 7/10 moving to 8/10 payroll tax for the transit system. And we may or may not directly benefit from that. Many businesses who pay that tax aren't on a transit line. The tax doesn't work that way. It's ubiquitous across the region. Everyone pays it, whether there's a bus stop near them or not. And so they're contributing to the regional system, even if they don't have an incremental benefit from it. And what they have said and do say is that, and that has gone up over time. So it used to be 6/10 and has ratcheted up to 7/10, and now is ratcheting up from 7/10 to 8/10. And in 2026, that will be 20 years of every year that payroll tax going up on businesses, going up 1/100% for 20 years. House Bill 2017 is a 1/10 tax on the employee. And, you know, there from time to time are conversations in Salem about going back and looking at that and saying, could that be 2/10, or, you know, could that ratchet up over time? I think that's a conversation that, you know, can happen with down in Salem. That wasn't universally supported. You know, there were organizations that opposed that because they saw it as a regressive tax. Most of the free systems, as I mentioned earlier, most of the free systems around the country are funded through a sales tax. A broad-based, you know, very ubiquitous sales tax. You know, sales taxes are great resources for programs and services like transit, but they tend to be regressive. And so, you know, how do you look at the source based on the, you know, sort of the equity picture? And then finally, I would say that the thing that we hear every time we talk to business about funding the system is the very first question out of their mouth is, what do the customers pay? How much do the riders pay for the system? What's their share? Because they want to know that the actual beneficiaries of the system are contributing something to the operation, rather than all of it coming from, or in this case, now that STIF is in place, 8 out of 9 tenths coming from the business community. And then on the research side, I'm happy to share with you the research that's out there. There's not a ton, and the research that we did around this effort is similar to the research that was done in the 98 study. The only reason I showed that wasn't to try to harken back to that study, but was to just note that all of the recommendations in that study that were made about how to improve the system, we've done, plus the low-income fare and the access transit program. So all the things that were suggested back in those 20 years ago, we've already implemented. So that was the only reason to raise that.
I might just add on to Bernie's comment and your question, Kathy, is something that wasn't referenced that is going to be coming up in the new year, I think, for us to watch. There was an announcement out from my counterpart in LA Metro. They're going to be looking at and studying a fareless system down in LA, the first system in the world of size. So they're going to try, I think, some pilots in the new year. So it'll be something for us all to keep on our radar screen as we continue to watch and learn. Now, their fare recovery, to Bernie's point, is not 18 to 20%, it's about 8. So they're at that smaller end with some scale. So, but I do think as this conversation and the data points and knowledge continues to grow, I think that's one of the areas we're going to want to watch, and happy to report back on at the right time as well. And then the second point I make is the other point of Bernie, where people are, fits with the research here, fits with other parts of the world where people are looking for less free and more, frequency, service levels, and reliability. I think if we look at this region, has about 4% transit user of all the trips in the region, based on Metro's 2015 number. Other regions in the world are at least in double digits, in some cases almost in the mid double digits. The Stockholms, the Copenhagens, the Londons of the world, they're in the 40% modal share. And then, so I think once you get to the double digits, now you've got scale that helps out with people who maybe need help more so than ever. I still think this region personally is still in the building stage on top of a really nice base, but I think we've still got a lot of building for that single dollar. Where do you put it for the greatest advantage for all? So I think once you get to a scale of building, then maybe that's a different time for that conversation.
I want to get to Ozzy. He's had his hand raised for a while there. Ozzy?
Thank you. I appreciate hearing your feedback. I had a couple of points. I wanted to just start with a saying that I remembered in Spanish in honor of Hispanic Heritage Month. I've been sprinkling around these things called dichos, these little sayings, and you reminded me of one now, Bernie, throughout the presentation, which I agree is very thorough, comprehensive, and really starts to show how this has been walked up to in many ways over time. Querer es poder is meaning that is essentially it translates into where there's a will, there's a way. And I know you've structured some of the more complicated financial puzzles I've seen. So I know that there's always potential ways, but I have to say out loud that I'm not sure that's a path that's in our best interests in the end. So I wanted to just make a couple of points that it turned out to me, because what stood out is I know that there's no such thing as free, and what we're really talking about is how to, the choice is not is it free or versus not free, it's how is it going to be funded, and should we be relying on the funding to be coming at the box office, as it were, at the ticket box, or some other way. And right now there's another thing that gnaws at me about that question, because I want it to be funded no matter what, but I want us to be smart about how we're funding and expanding a system that to this day we have presented to the public as a essentially not trust-based system, but the boarding has been more of a you can get on, especially
honor system.
It's an honors. Thank you. It's an honor system, and we have an opportunity. To me, the question isn't is it free or not. It's more of where should the funding best be resourced from, and we already invest in some version of enforcement. The fare box system gives us meaningful information, but doesn't necessarily ensure higher ridership or higher recoveries. We are still having to look at that through its own way. And even though we have enforcement officers or compliance officers that don't need to make enforcement their reason for existing and being in the system, I think we should look at alternatives to the turnstile or the fare box, because we don't have turnstiles, we don't have that physical barrier that makes it that prevents that casual, I just thought I can get away with it, which creates this entire relationship with the public that I'm not sure we want. A pre-funded system that gets sort of cashed in at the fare box with the tap, I think gives us all the information we need, but allows us to access funding through many channels, which could be private and could be public. I'm thinking, Kathy, Director Y, pardon me, about your question about the business community. And I think that there's more appetite for direct relationship funding mechanisms right now than there would be to let's add a tax onto some aspect of a business operational structure, and let's feed it into an agency or more than one agency to get it into this fare box or this fareless system. That presents an entire different conversation about geographic disparity, because what regions pay and what regions benefit is an entire other sort of layer to this, and that's definitely something that we get around if we look at how to make a pre-funded mechanism that is available to private and public partners. So individual cities, individual counties, or individual companies can decide, much like Metro is doing with T2020, let's do a prepaid, pre-funded system where we put in a certain amount and we promote utilization and we put it out to service our constituents, and we let that drive how we feed that system. And so there's this, natural learning, organic utilization to it. I'm also a big fan of maintaining and expanding the low-income fare model. I think of it much like when I was in school, the free and reduced lunch. We have it here in PPS. There should be a free and a reduced fare mechanism that is available to people. so that we still have the benefit of that relationship. We get the loyalty rewards, we get the tap information, but we're also creating that vehicle for people to opt in for free. And there should be criteria around it all. But I think that having those pathways and really leveraging the hop card takes us into a direction that I think allows us to be the agency that lets us leverage that 75% rider that's doing it out of choice, and really lean into that. Because at the end of the day, my final point is that the real choice to me is I between making a system that's awesome versus not awesome. I want this system to be awesome. I want to elevate public transit, and I think making it more accessible, making it so that more choice riders come in, isn't a binary, and we could do that. I believe that looking at how to fund it better, and maybe getting ourselves away from the fare box, could give us more avenues. And I've never thought to call that free ridership, but it just means that we have an avenue for high schoolers to get free ridership, and we have those allies. We have an avenue for all sorts of communities and all sorts of riders to have that. And it includes, who wants to go to the farmer's market? Well, maybe the farmer's market has a mechanism where people that shop get that fare recovered or returned to their card or whatever, if they shop there. Little things like that I think essentially allow us to get the benefit that we're looking for. But it reshapes the conversation on how do we better fund ridership, so that we can encourage it and make it available instead of making it free. And I think that's a puzzle that is more approachable, and I think puts TriMet in the position that it needs to be, which is a great transit system. And I think those bells and whistles don't come through taxing the rich and forcing them to pay into a free system. I don't think that's the storyline that gets us to that end.
Ozzy, thank you very much for those comments. I guess I want to second a lot of what you said there. And when I look at this issue, I think I was probably involved in the 1998 study. And I think in some ways, my opinion hasn't changed from some of the stuff I saw back then, which is I've always thought that the users ought to pay some share of the cost for the service. And I don't know what that level is right now. It's 20, 25%, whatever it is here in our system. I don't know whether that's the right level or not, but it seems like a fairly good level to me. And I haven't seen, nor did I see then, anything that really showed me that going free was going to increase ridership in a significant way, get us to that, the big change from 4% to 10% to 20%, whatever else. And the region doesn't have a sales tax or any other thing that we want to do. And when I looked at it then, and I used to ride the rail and buses a lot downtown when I worked downtown and on the east side. And when Fairless Square was in place, there was a lot of undesirable folks riding the train, which made a lot of people uncomfortable on the train. And I talked to a lot of folks who would never get on a light rail vehicle or never get on a bus because of what was going on down there. The elimination of the Fairless Square and then the free rail actually, I believe, is taking care of that a lot. And so I worry a lot about the unintended consequences of a free fare. But again, it gets back to things that Bernie outlined pretty well. So I think we need to get smarter, but I think we need to look at this in a different way, like maybe you're thinking about how do we really build a system. And ultimately, we may not have the right funding mix or the right funding sources to do this, but we got to get a lot smarter and figure out what we really want to do to get to the level of ridership we want, and really start with that as the guiding principle with everything we do, and then make sure we're servicing not only the low income and folks who need to get from point A to point B, but you're right, keep those choice riders on the system, because that's what's so unique about Portland. And we want to get people out of their cars. That's one of the big reasons we're doing all this stuff, to try to eliminate greenhouse gases. So I think this is a rich discussion, and I suspect we'll be having it again because people are going to be pushing us to have this discussion. But I want to figure out how we frame it in a way that gets to a lot of the things you said, Ozzy. So thanks for bringing that up.
I just have a quick comment.
Sure.
You know, I think you raised this in your last point, Bruce, but I think we really do need to continue to engage community in this. You know, I think we are 7 publicly appointed officials, and when we're talking about this, you know, fair conversation, service expansion, that is directly going to impact our riders and the public. So, so I think you know, I know that this meeting is being recorded, and so, you know, that's great. People can take a look at it later. But I also don't know how many people are going to be tuning into TriMet board sessions on a regular basis and trying to get right all of this rich information and discussion. My guess is probably not. I think they're going to be busy doing their own lives. But I know that absolutely this is going to be a conversation that so many folks are going to feel passionately about on either side of their opinion. So I think we need to have more discussions, and that was also the reason why I brought up that 1998 research that hopefully could be shared back with us, because, like I said, that's a 20-year-old research project, and I feel like now with climate change, you know, as another top of mind issue, continuing to see gentrification, we're going to have new census data come out in 2020. I feel like we just need to be a little bit more relevant and more up to date with everything that is happening in the 21st century. So I would love to see more research happening.
Points well taken.
Thank you.
Any other board members want to weigh on this? We're way over time on this one, but I think it's an important issue, and it will be coming back to us from many ways, I'm sure.
Bruce?
Yes.
Whether it's relevant, I think it's relevant. I worked in California in the community colleges when tuition was free. And I saw the abuses where individuals would enroll in courses, blocking students that really wanted the courses, but then they didn't show up. It didn't take very long for the legislature to decide that free was not what really determined what was best for people within that industry. And they realized that convenience was more important than price. And I go back to, I use that as a situation. I know when Oregon was considering making community colleges free, it was like, learn from your southern neighbors about the lack of effectiveness of that type of a program. But what rings with me is that, again, more recently, in terms of my work experience, we found that convenience always weighed out heavier with individuals than price. Now, we've got programs that support individuals that have difficulty coming up with price. But, you know, I just personally, at this point, believe that it's reasonable with an agency as complex as TriMet, and with all the demand placed on it. I think people make ideological requests for things without understanding the consequences of those requests. And, you know, I'm happy to continue the conversation, but I think it has to be, we have an obligation as individual board members to try to help the community understand the funding mechanisms and what the consequences are, because most people just think free is free. They don't realize that there is a consequence to that. And, you know, so anyway, I'll end my conversation that way. But, you know, I've had experience where free doesn't work. And if we have choice riders, I think that, and we're making provisions for people who have limited resources, I think we've got the best of every world right now. And I don't think it has anything to do with which century we're in.
I think you're on mute, Bruce.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. I just said thank you very much, Linda. Any other comments or thoughts from the rest of the board? All right, I'm not seeing any. So here we are. It is at 11:42. We were scheduled to take a break at 11:15 and then get back to the fair enforcement and policy changes. How's the board doing? We want to just forge ahead, or
A 10-minute break would be good.
all right. Well, why don't we take a 10-minute break? But then, so we're going to be going a little longer. That's okay with everybody?
We, Mr. Board President, we have a choice that might, as an alternative for consider, take a 10-minute break, come back and continue on for the time allocated, extending the time. Or conversely, depending on how the board wishes, we could remove this item and actually cover it at one of the next October board briefings in about three weeks. It's your decision. I'm just trying to give you alternatives here.
That's a good alternative. I was going to suggest that dialogue, but if you hadn't, so
Policy changes.
my preference would actually be to not try to squeeze that in today. I think I'm seeing some fatigue on people right at the moment, and we've had a really good dialogue.
I'm fine with
wrap up.
Fine
So
with moving it, Mr. Chair.
I heard Keith. How about Ozzy?
I actually prefer we move it.
Okay, Lori.
Yeah. If, as long as we're not overloading the agenda on our next meeting, and we end up, I don't want to end up in the same position of running out of time, but that's fine with me to move it.
Okay, Linda.
Yeah, I'm fine with moving it.
Okay, and Kathy.
That's fine.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking what we ought to do is instead of trying to force some time.
I think it's fine too.
Who did I miss? Oh, Travis. Sorry about that.
I agree. I'm in.
All right. Thank you. All right. Well, look, rather than taking a break, why don't we just kind of do some closing thoughts here? Doug, do you have any thoughts for us in terms of close?
I sure do. Thank you. So to those who are presenting, Marla and Justin and to John Gardner, so just stay tuned. We'll get you reconnected in here. We're going to target Mr. Board President for the October board briefing session coming up here in about 3+ weeks. We don't want to lose this. So I'll put that one aside. Firstly, from my perspective, from management perspective, we put a lot at you today in about 3 hours. I really welcome the dialogue, particularly on the financial piece, which feeds to the business plan. And you've given us some really salient and helpful nuggets for us to reconnect on that business plan, let alone the finance piece. So what you will see next is coming up to the business plan is the November board strategy session. We do not have a board meeting, official board meeting in November, but that's when we'll bring the next round of management needs to think about some of the comments that you were made today, and we will reflect that back to you at the November session as we now move on in the building of the fiscal year budget in question for FY21 or 2022. But also the business plan itself for the year in question and beyond. So I think in that piece, it was really helpful. To the last section we just had on the fair enforcement, as I listened to the discussion, what I might suggest is I think this is discussion, President Warren, as you've indicated, this needs to continue around fair enforcement and whether there are other ways to look at things. So I would suggest that management come back to the board in an update at maybe a future board strategy session, whether it be March or September, probably September one this time next year, with an update on where we are, particularly after learning about LA. I think that there may be some really helpful information and that may help us figure out what does TriMet want to take out of that and move on it. So that's what I might suggest. But I think today was just from my perspective, a very useful and valuable session in particular. So I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Good. Well, I guess my closing thoughts would be that, yeah, I thought there was a lot of interest, especially on the finance and budget discussion. And what I really heard was there's a desire by the board to really stay connected Maybe get involved right on the kind of the, make sure we're all on the same page in terms of criteria for how we're going to move forward with some of the priorities and the things we want to move into the next year's budget. So I think we've got a great deal of interest and support from the board to get some time to do that. I also think I heard a really a desire to keep us updated on some of the changes in the assumptions, like the STIF monies, the state monies, it did more. Any CARES Act 2 type stuff, as that boils out, just make sure we're brought up to speed. And if you hear something, I think what I'm hearing here is just send us a quick note so we know what's going on, just to keep us up to speed on that. On the business plan, I think we had a pretty good discussion. We didn't dig into it as much, but again, I'll just remind folks that this is a precursor to the budget and the priorities for the general manager and the organization. So I will follow up with the board on the general manager's goals and objectives for this current fiscal year we're in. And so Keith, if you can get back to me on the suggestions that Doug, you and me, that'd be great. I can get that out to the board. And I encourage the board to really take a close look at that to make sure we're capturing the priorities and issues that we want the general manager to focus on in the next year and a half. And we can get that finalized and make it clear to everybody else what we're looking at. And then I guess the only other thing I would say is in terms of the fairness analysis, what I'm hearing is a need for data and information. So yeah, as you learn out there, Doug, and the rest of the staff, and what's going on around the United States, we need to get that information, and this is something that will not go away. I know that. So we'll be talking about it some more. So all in all, I was really pleased with today's session and the information that was presented. I guess I would ask the board if they have any final comments or suggestions before we sign off. Travis?
Why, thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I just want to say that it was great information, similar to last Friday. Just a string of just great meetings that add to kind of the fabric of our discussion and our kind of knowledge base. I thought today's was very thorough with the financial projections, and then also the information that we received on kind of the fair and the adjustments there, and then also on the business plan, all things that correlate with one another that actually, as I listened and took in all the information, kind of all the intersections of all the things that we're talking about have significant impacts over the next 3, 5, 10 years. But we've got some critical issues that we have to cover in the next 3 to 5 years, that all the things that we just referenced this morning kind of have these intersections. And I want to take time to kind of digest it all as we continue to deliberate the challenges that we see in front of us, but also the opportunities. So thank you to the team for the immense amount of work that you put into all of these presentations. It doesn't really reflect just in the short time that you have to share with us, but we know what it takes to put all of this together. So thank you. Very, very worth our time.
Good, thanks. Kathy, any comments?
I also just echo what Travis said. I really appreciate the team for really highlighting a lot of high-level issues for the board to consider. I thought all the presentations were great, and I guess I'm just going to have to find some more time processing everything, because it was a lot that we covered. I don't know if we can make some of these sessions in the future a little bit more light, maybe just with 1 or 2 topics. That would be sort of just, I don't know, my request, so that it's not 3.5 hour long meetings. But I really enjoyed all of these topics, and I agree that moving forward, we're just going to have to get more innovative and creative about the way that we're serving riders.
Thanks. Keith?
Thank you. I think this was a very good meeting, a lot of good information, a lot to digest, but at the same time, a lot of good information. And like I say, I just applaud Doug and your team for bringing very comprehensive information. Dee, Alan, and certainly Bernie, everyone that brought information today was, like I say, it was really good information for us. and it helps us so we can make informed decisions. And that's the important part of it. That's what I really appreciate. So thank you.
Good. Linda?
Everyone else, I appreciated the presentations. I thought they were very concise and informative. And my takeaway from it, which has been consistent all along, is just how complex this organization is in terms of where its funding comes from, how we plan, how we try to evaluate strategies for the way we serve the public. It's just, it's very complex. And the information that was given today, particularly around the financial outlook, is helpful to me as I talk to individuals who continually want more from TriMet, but don't understand the trade-offs and the financial pressures that the agency is under. So thank you very much.
Lori?
Was that me that you called on?
Yes, it was.
Sorry, my connection dropped for just a second there. Yeah, I want to also acknowledge all the tremendous amount of staff time that went into these presentations. It's very, very much appreciated, and it's very impressive, everything that you've pulled together for us. I think I want to, brag a little bit about TriMet. If you look at the challenges that the entire country is dealing with right now, and on top of COVID, of course, in the West Coast, we have the air quality issues and the economic crisis that we're undergoing. It's very impressive that how well TriMet is doing, how we've been able to continue to serve our customers. No layoffs. We're not retrenching, but we're actually, as we've shown today, we're looking to the future, how to continue to improve and make the service even better. So I'm just really thrilled and really proud to be associated with everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Ozzy?
Thank you very much. There we go. I appreciate it. And thanks to everyone that presented today. Alan, Dee, and Bernie, you all did a fantastic job of working through these issues, and your information is well structured. I really appreciate the preparation to present today. And so to Doug and the staff, I just want to say that, as a board member, it's really important to navigate all of this. As I see you navigate all this, that I feel not only confident, and I do, but I also want to be able to turn around and properly defend the tough decisions that are being made. So that's where just being able to understand these things and take this time is really, really meaningful. So I really appreciate that. And I want to continue to be able to defend these tough decisions. So I want to continue to understand them, and that's important to me. And to the board, I know that we're stuck between what we can be and what we want to be right now, because the world has created very different decisions for us right now. But in becoming that entity we want to be, while we're navigating this, I think it's very important to keep in mind our commitment to the public, and how, regardless of the tough decisions we have to make here, the North Star is how do we continue to create a transit agency that we are helping uphold the highest interest for the public and the highest value proposition for the public, which is more than just, did it get me there on time? That's the jobs, the benefits, the health, the community connectivity, all of that, and the equity and access is a part of that. So let's continue to keep that in mind and always strive to do our best within what we can be while we're becoming what we want to be.
Wow, Ozzy, thank you so much. Appreciate that. Well, I guess I just want to echo again, thanks to the staff for doing the hard prep to make this look pretty easy want to acknowledge the board for actually, and staff for actually learning how to use WebEx a whole lot better. We're doing a pretty good job here. So I like that. And I just have to say how humbled and proud I am to be part of this board. It's a good group of folks who are very thoughtful, and I do appreciate your public service. So thanks for what you do. With that, I'm going to say let's end this meeting. And Doug, I'll look for you and the staff to come up with a way how we get the discussion of the item we missed today on board at one of our upcoming meetings without overloading us. But I think you guys did well today, and I feel like we needed all the time we needed on these items. So thank you.
Thank you all. And yes, leave that to me, President Warner. I'll take care of it.
All right, sounds good. All right,
Thank you
have
all.
a good rest of the day, you guys.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.